The air in ancient Egypt carried whispers of power, spoken in words that held life and death in their syllables. Among the golden sands and the towering monuments, there was something more potent than the armies of pharaohs or the engineering marvels of pyramids. It was the belief that words, when wielded with intention, could shape reality itself. A curse wasn't just a threat, it was a force, alive and pulsating, waiting to claim its victim. In the land where gods walked among men and the afterlife was as tangible as the Nile, curses were woven into the very fabric of existence. These weren't empty threats written in stone, they were promises carried by the winds of the desert, cloaked in the authority of deities and ancestors. To curse someone in ancient Egypt was to unchain forces that could haunt their every breath, every step, and even their soul after death. Imagine standing before a tomb, the air thick with an unnatural silence, and reading the hieroglyphs etched into the stone. Death will come on swift wings to those who disturb the eternal rest of this sacred place. The words sit heavy, their weight felt not just in the mind but in the chest, as though the stones themselves are pressing against your ribs. To the Egyptians, curses weren't mere words, they were Heka, magic. Every syllable carried a vibration, and every vibration had a consequence. A curse could protect a tomb, punish a thief, or bind an enemy for eternity. The magic of the curse lay in its precision, crafted with care. It was a contract between the curser and the divine, an assurance that justice would prevail, even if it took centuries. There were curses spoken aloud, hurled like a thunderbolt at those who dared to harm. Others were written, inscribed on stone or papyrus, meant to outlive their creators. Some were subtle, hidden in the folds of everyday life, embedded in amulets, or painted into the frescoes that adorned the walls of temples. And then there were the curses that didn't need words at all, carried instead by the unspoken gaze of a statue, its eyes following intruders with an eerie persistence. It was said that those who ignored these warnings often paid the price in ways that defied reason. A merchant who looted a tomb to sell its treasures might find his crops failing, his livestock perishing, and his children falling ill. The curse didn't always strike immediately, it was patient, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash its wrath. Imagine the terror of the accused, their every misfortune viewed through the lens of the curse. A man wakes up to find his fields inexplicably barren. A woman loses her jewelry, only to hear whispers that it belonged to a long-dead queen. Every flicker of bad luck becomes a thread in the web tightening around them, spun by forces they cannot see or fight. But curses weren't always about punishment. Sometimes, they were shields, crafted with love and desperation to protect the dead. A grieving father might curse the grave of his child, vowing torment on anyone who dared disturb their rest. These words were etched into the tomb walls, meant to guard against grave robbers and wandering spirits. The father's anguish, his need to preserve what little he had left of his child, gave the curse its power. Even pharaohs, believed to be gods on earth, were not exempt from the need for protection. Their tombs bore some of the most elaborate curses, their hieroglyphs carved deep into the stone as though to ensure their permanence. These warnings were a last line of defense against the greed of men who sought to plunder the riches buried with the kings. May the crocodile devour those who break the seal, one curse might read, invoking Sobek, the god of the Nile. Another might summon Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead, to hunt down violators in both life and the afterlife. But what gave these curses their potency wasn't just the fear of divine retribution, it was the belief that the words themselves were alive. To speak a curse was to breathe life into it, to set it free into the world, where it would bide its time until its conditions were met. This belief in the tangible power of words wasn't unique to curses, it was woven into the entire culture. Words could bless, heal, or bring prosperity, but when turned dark, they became weapons more fearsome than swords. The people of ancient Egypt lived in a world where the unseen was as real as the seen. They believed in spirits that roamed the earth, and gods who listened to prayers, and in curses that clung to the air like a storm waiting to break. These beliefs weren't rooted in ignorance, they were born from a deep understanding of the fragility of life and the need to maintain balance in an unpredictable world. A curse, then, was not just an act of vengeance or protection, it was a reflection of the society that created it. It spoke of their fears, their hopes, and their unyielding connection to the divine. It was a reminder that in the land of the Pharaohs, even the dead could speak, and their words carried a weight that echoed through eternity. To walk among the tombs of ancient Egypt is to feel the lingering presence of those words. The air seems heavier, the shadows deeper, as though the stones themselves are alive with the energy of countless curses. And as you stand there, reading the warnings left by those long gone, you can't help but wonder, do they still watch, waiting to claim their next victim? The screen flickers, casting shadows across the room as an ancient tomb fills the frame. A group of adventurers, dust-covered and wide-eyed, stumbles into the heart of a forgotten chamber. A sarcophagus looms before them, its intricate carvings glinting in the dim light. Whispers of a curse linger in the air. Someone brushes against an ancient artifact, and suddenly the walls seem to breathe. A chilling gust extinguishes their torches. Then, one by one, they begin to fall, stricken by unseen hands. This is the scene we've been shown, time and again. Egyptian curses transformed into tales of horror, suspense, and doom. Hollywood has long painted them as the wrathful vengeance of ancient gods, unleashed on those foolish enough to trespass. It's a formula designed to thrill, the clash of human greed against supernatural justice, where the intruders are almost always outmatched. But how much of this cinematic curse is rooted in the sands of reality? The stories start innocently enough, a discovery, a cracked seal, a glimmer of treasure. But in Hollywood's hands, the desert becomes a stage, and ancient Egypt transforms into a place where curses leap from hieroglyphs like coiled vipers. The mummy is awakened, wrapped in tattered bandages, her fury transcending time. Death becomes an art form, grotesque and theatrical, as one victim succumbs to scarabs burrowing beneath their skin and another is swallowed by a pit of snakes. These tales have a way of gripping us, don't they? They tap into something primal, a fear of the unknown, a respect for forces we cannot see or control. They make us believe that the sands of Egypt hold secrets too dangerous for mortal hands. Yet, for all the chills and thrills, the reality of these curses was far more nuanced, far more human. Curses in ancient Egypt weren't about vengeance for vengeance's sake. They were safeguards, born of love and fear. A pharaoh's tomb, filled with treasures meant to provide comfort in the afterlife, was a target for thieves. To protect it, warnings were carved into stone, invoking the wrath of gods to deter intruders. They weren't the violent, all-consuming plagues that Hollywood portrays, but quiet, calculated threats designed to make even the boldest thief hesitate. But the truth doesn't sell tickets. Hollywood needed drama, something to make your skin crawl and your heart race. So the curses were exaggerated, stripped of their cultural context and reshaped into tools of terror. The media followed suit, with breathless headlines turning every tomb discovery into a potential death trap. Take the infamous case of Tutankhamun's tomb. When Lord Carnarvon, one of the men who funded its excavation, died suddenly after its opening, the press was quick to blame the so-called curse of the pharaohs. The cause of death, a mosquito bite that became infected, was mundane, but it didn't matter. The curse had already captured the public's imagination. Every subsequent mishap involving anyone remotely connected to the tomb was attributed to its vengeance. This narrative snowballed, fueled by sensational stories and the allure of the mysterious East. The curse became a character in its own right, its victims piling up in newspaper columns and campfire tales. It didn't matter that many of those who worked on Tutankhamun's tomb lived long, uneventful lives. The curse was too compelling to question. Over time, the media's portrayal of Egyptian curses began to shape how we see ancient Egypt itself. It became a land of danger and mysticism, where every artifact was a potential Pandora's box. This portrayal stripped the culture of its depth, reducing it to a backdrop for Western adventurers to battle supernatural forces. The pharaohs became villains, their curses weapons in an eternal war against the living. And yet, for all its distortions, there's a reason these stories resonate. They speak to a universal truth: the past is powerful. There's something humbling about standing before a tomb that has endured for millennia, its stones whispering of a world that once was. The idea that these ancient people could reach across time to touch us, to remind us of their presence, is both haunting and beautiful. But what the movies miss is the humanity behind the curses. They weren't just about fear, they were about love, loss, and the desperate need to hold onto something in a world that offered no guarantees. A mother might curse the grave of her child, not out of malice, but out of a need to protect what little she had left. A pharaoh might inscribe a warning on his tomb, not out of arrogance, but out of a desire to preserve his legacy. In the end, the true curse might be how these stories have overshadowed the reality. The pharaohs weren't villains, and their curses weren't weapons of destruction. They were expressions of a culture that valued the balance between life and death, that believed in the power of words to shape the world. So as the credits roll on yet another Hollywood depiction of ancient Egypt, with its collapsing tombs and vengeful spirits, it's worth remembering the truth behind the fiction. The curses weren't about revenge, they were about memory, about holding onto something sacred in a world that is always moving forward, always forgetting. And perhaps, in a way, that's the most powerful curse of all. The room was still, but the weight of something unseen pressed down, heavy and unrelenting. A feather, pure and unblemished, rested on one side of a golden scale. On the other side, a human heart, beating, pulsing, alive even in death. Around the scene, gods and goddesses stood like statues, their eyes burning with quiet judgment. The heart tipped the scale, wobbling ever so slightly. Everything, fate, eternity, redemption, hung in that fragile balance. This was Ma'at. Not just a goddess, but a force, a truth that bound everything together. Ma'at was balance, the thread that stitched the chaos of the universe into harmony. To the ancient Egyptians, life itself was an extension of this delicate order. Every action, every word, every breath contributed to this cosmic dance. And when Ma'at faltered, when chaos, or Isfet, crept in, things broke. Lives unraveled. Civilizations crumbled. Curses weren't born from hatred or spite. They were born from Ma'at, tools to restore what was broken. They weren't wild acts of vengeance, as so many believe today. They were justice, calibrated with the precision of the divine. When someone disrupted the natural order, plundering a tomb, spilling innocent blood, or twisting sacred oaths, the curse became the unseen hand, steadying the tilting scale. The Egyptians believed that balance wasn't just a concept, it was survival. The Nile floods had to come at the right time, no more, no less. The sun needed to rise each day, Ra's journey through the underworld unbroken. Even the smallest shift could invite chaos. A stolen artifact, a desecrated temple, wasn't just a crime against property, it was a crack in the foundation of the universe. Imagine standing before the tomb of a pharaoh, its stone walls cool beneath your fingers. You've heard the warnings, the ones carved in sharp, angular hieroglyphs. They're not threats, they're promises. Whoever disturbs this eternal resting place will lose the light of life. Their name will be erased from the book of the living. It's not just fear that grips you, it's reverence. You understand now, the curse isn't about punishment. It's about protection, about holding the fragile threads of Ma'at together. The Egyptians saw death not as an end, but as a transformation. The afterlife was a continuation of the soul's journey, a place where harmony needed to be preserved just as carefully as in a living world. To disturb the dead wasn't just disrespectful, it was dangerous. It risked unraveling the balance they had so carefully maintained in life. There is an ancient tale, whispered in temple shadows, of a scribe who stole a gold amulet from a grave. He was no ordinary thief, he was desperate. His child was sick, his home crumbling. He believed the gods would understand, that they would forgive. But forgiveness wasn't the point. The act itself sent ripples through the delicate fabric of Ma'at. Within days, his child's illness worsened, his crops failed, and his name was spoken with curses in the streets. It wasn't wrath that destroyed him. It was imbalance, the natural consequence of tipping the scale. To the Egyptians, curses were alive, not in a supernatural sense, but as extensions of Ma'at's will. They were woven into the fabric of spells and rituals, activated by actions that broke the sacred order. A farmer might curse his fields to protect them from thieves, invoking the gods to guard what he had worked so hard to cultivate. A mother might speak a quiet curse over her child's grave, not out of anger but out of love, a plea to the gods to keep her child's resting place undisturbed. Even pharaohs, the living embodiments of Ma'at, were bound by its laws. They carried the burden of upholding balance not just in their lands, but in the cosmos itself. A pharaoh who ruled unjustly risked cursing his entire lineage, his name erased from monuments and memory. It was said that when Akhenaten abandoned the old gods, the temples themselves seemed to crumble, their stones unable to hold the weight of his defiance. Yet, Ma'at wasn't cruel. She was fair. She didn't demand perfection, only effort, a willingness to uphold harmony in a world constantly teetering on the edge of chaos. The curses weren't traps set by vengeful spirits. They were safeguards, measures to remind humanity of its responsibility to the balance that gave life meaning. The modern world sees curses as superstition, relics of a time when people feared what they couldn't explain. But for the Egyptians, they were as real as the Nile's waters. They weren't just words etched into stone, they were a reflection of their deepest beliefs, their understanding of a world that existed not in black and white but in the subtle shades of balance and disorder. To walk in ancient Egypt was to walk a tightrope stretched between the seen and the unseen, between the living and the dead, between harmony and chaos. Ma'at was the net beneath, but even a net can break if stretched too far. And so, they carved their warnings, their pleas, their curses into the walls of tombs and temples. Not to frighten, but to remind. To keep the scale from tipping. The scribe sat cross-legged in the dim glow of an oil lamp, his reed brush trembling slightly in his hand. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, thick and heady, as though the gods themselves were leaning in to listen. Before him, a pristine sheet of papyrus waited, its surface unmarked yet brimming with potential. He whispered the words softly as he wrote, each syllable measured, deliberate, alive. These were not ordinary words. They were power incarnate. They carried Heka, the force that threaded the universe together. To the Egyptians, words weren't mere sounds, they were acts of creation. To speak a thing was to give it life. To write it down was to make it eternal. The ancients believed that the world itself had been spoken into existence, shaped by the gods through the force of Heka. This belief infused every syllable, every stroke of the reed brush, with a significance that we, in our modern world of fleeting texts and disposable words, can barely grasp. Words were bridges between the mortal and the divine, tools capable of bending reality itself. Curses were crafted with this power, not as mere threats, but as living entities. The scribe, hunched over his work, wasn't just writing. He was weaving, stitching together a tapestry of forces that would outlast him, that could outlast even the stones of the temple walls. The ink, black as night, was mixed with soot and the sap of sacred plants. Each character, each glyph, was inscribed with precision, imbued with intent. To curse someone was no careless act. It was an invocation, a contract sealed with the weight of cosmic authority. The words weren't just commands, they were vessels, carrying the will of the one who spoke them. A single misstep in phrasing, a single slip of the brush, could alter the meaning, redirect the energy, and bring unintended consequences. The scribes who penned these spells were revered and feared in equal measure. They were keepers of a knowledge so potent that it could protect a kingdom or destroy it. They were trained not just in language, but in the art of balance, understanding that the power they wielded came with responsibility. There is an ancient tale of a farmer who sought revenge against a neighbor who had stolen his land. Desperate, he went to a temple scribe and begged for a curse. The scribe agreed but warned him, "These words are alive. They will do as they are told, but they will watch you too. If your heart is untrue, they will turn on you." The farmer, blinded by anger, dismissed the warning. The curse was written, the words carrying their sharp edges into the unseen world. Within days, the thief's crops withered, his livestock fell ill. But the farmer's own fields began to fail as well. He realized too late that his greed had tipped the balance, and the words had found him wanting. The role of sacred texts in these spells cannot be overstated. The Egyptians believed that certain words, when spoken or written in the correct order, held the keys to divine intervention. These texts weren't just instructions, they were blueprints for altering the fabric of existence. The Book of the Dead, with its intricate spells and incantations, wasn't a mere guide for the afterlife. It was a testament to the belief in the enduring power of words. Inscriptions on tomb walls often carried curses meant to guard against grave robbers. These weren't idle threats. They were precise, calculated, designed to summon forces that would protect the dead and their possessions. The words were often accompanied by images, each symbol a piece of the puzzle, each line a thread pulling the visible and invisible worlds together. The power of these words wasn't confined to curses. They could heal as well as harm, create as well as destroy. The same Heka that gave life to a curse could be used to bless a marriage, ensure a bountiful harvest, or guide a soul safely through the trials of the afterlife. But it was the curses, with their raw intensity, that left the deepest marks on those who encountered them. Standing in the shadow of a tomb, reading the sharp-edged hieroglyphs etched into the stone, one could almost feel the words humming with energy. The one who disturbs this grave shall be devoured by crocodiles, burned by fire, and forgotten by the gods. The threats were vivid, terrifying, but they weren't mindless. They were measured, each punishment fitting the crime, each word chosen with care. Even today, the remnants of this belief linger. The idea that words have weight, that they carry consequences, is a legacy of the ancient Egyptians. We may no longer fear curses as they did, but we still feel the sting of a careless remark, the warmth of a kind word. Somewhere, deep in our collective memory, we understand that words are not empty. The scribe finished his work, his hand steady despite the weight of what he had just written. He read the words aloud, his voice low and steady, each syllable resonating in the silent chamber. The ink glistened in the lamplight, the papyrus humming with unseen energy. And then, with a final breath, he sealed the scroll, the words alive, waiting, ready to fulfill their purpose. The temple was silent except for the soft shuffle of sandaled feet on stone. A priest, cloaked in pristine white linen, stood before an altar carved with sacred symbols. His hands moved with practiced precision, sprinkling crushed lotus petals into a small bronze bowl. The air thickened with the sharp tang of burning incense, a signal to unseen forces that they were being summoned. In ancient Egypt, priests and magicians were more than mere mortals. They were the conduits between the human and divine, wielding powers that could shift the fate of kings and crumble empires. To stand in their presence was to feel the weight of worlds colliding, the tangible and intangible, the mortal and eternal. These men and women carried authority that could not be questioned. Their voices held the cadence of gods, their movements a choreography of rituals passed down through generations. They spoke to the unseen forces with unwavering certainty, crafting spells that could protect or destroy, heal or harm, bless or curse. When a priest raised his staff and chanted words carved from the essence of creation itself, the atmosphere would change. Time seemed to slow as the syllables fell from his lips, each one deliberate and precise, echoing against the ancient stone walls. The power wasn't in the volume but in the intent. Every word carried a purpose, every gesture an unspoken command. Magicians, too, bore this burden, their role often shadowed in secrecy. Unlike the priests, who served openly in the temples, magicians worked in the spaces between light and dark. They were the keepers of forbidden knowledge, their spells etched onto scraps of papyrus or whispered in hushed tones over an open flame. To them, curses were not acts of anger or spite but tools wielded with exacting care. It was said that a magician could summon the strength of the Nile itself, calling its waters to rise and wash away those who dared defy their master. A whispered blessing could ensure the safe birth of a child, while a single curse could render an entire lineage barren. Their craft was equal parts awe and terror, their presence both revered and feared. The rituals were not performed lightly. A mistake could mean the spell would backfire, wreaking havoc on the caster instead of the intended target. Priests and magicians were acutely aware of the balance they had to maintain. They lived in constant awareness of Ma'at, the cosmic order, and their actions had to align with this sacred equilibrium. One story speaks of a priest named Achenuzer, tasked with protecting the tomb of a pharaoh who had recently passed into the afterlife. The king's enemies sought to desecrate his final resting place, and the priest knew his duty extended beyond the mortal plane. By the flickering light of an oil lamp, Achenuzer inscribed a curse onto the walls of the tomb, each hieroglyph carved with steady hands and a heart heavy with the responsibility of his task. "May the scorpion strike your hand, the crocodile devour your flesh, and the jackal feast upon your soul," the curse read. These weren't empty threats, but calls to ancient forces that watched over the tombs and their treasures. The words were alive, thrumming with the energy of the priest's intent. Years later, when grave robbers tried to break in, they were found lifeless at the tomb's entrance, their faces frozen in terror. But their powers were not limited to curses. Blessings, too, were a significant part of their duties. A priest would stand before a field, his arms raised to the sky, and chant to the gods for rain. A magician, with a stroke of his brush, could inscribe symbols of protection onto an amulet, ensuring the wearer's safety in battle. Each act, whether of light or shadow, was carried out with the same solemnity, the same unwavering belief in the power they wielded. The people trusted these masters of the arcane, even as they feared them. To ask for a blessing was to risk earning a curse. To seek protection from one magician might mean invoking the wrath of another. Yet, in a world where the gods seemed so close, their presence almost tangible, there was no choice but to believe. In their roles, priests and magicians became the guardians of life and death, of hope and despair. They carried burdens that few could understand, walking the fine line between reverence and blasphemy, creation and destruction. Their spells were not merely tools, they were acts of faith, expressions of a belief system that saw the world as a tapestry woven with threads of magic. Even now, the echoes of their chants linger in the temples, their hieroglyphs etched into stone, silent yet potent reminders of a time when words could alter the stars and curses could outlive the centuries. A cold, moonlit night. A figure kneels beside an unmarked grave, their hands trembling as they place a small lead tablet into the earth. Inscribed on its surface are words etched with purpose, words not meant for human ears, but for forces unseen. The air feels heavy, as if holding its breath. The figure mutters an incantation, their voice a whisper against the stillness, and then the tablet is buried. The deed is done. Cursed tablets, simple in appearance but immense in power, were never mere objects. They were vessels of emotion, desperation, vengeance, and sometimes justice. Made of thin sheets of lead, these tablets bore inscriptions scratched hurriedly or meticulously, depending on the intent of the hand that wrote them. Each word was deliberate, each symbol a binding thread tying the living world to the spirits and gods that governed fate. The act of crafting a cursed tablet was deeply personal. A man betrayed by a lover might write their name and plead for their infidelity to lead to ruin. A rival in business might find their name etched alongside a request for their downfall. The words were raw and unfiltered, often laced with anger or sorrow. They were written with a ferocity that could be felt centuries later, as archaeologists unearthed these silent witnesses to human despair. Once inscribed, the tablet wasn't left in just any place. Placement was crucial, for the curse needed an audience. Graves were common sights, the belief being that the spirits of the dead, restless and hungry for purpose, could carry out the curses inscribed. Sometimes, these tablets were folded or pierced with nails, the physical act symbolizing the binding or torment of the intended target. It was not enough to write the curse, the ritual had to seal its intent. Inscriptions on these tablets often invoked gods or spirits, calling them to act as witnesses or enforcers. An individual might call upon Anubis, the guide of souls, to ensure that the curse found its mark in both the mortal world and the afterlife. Others invoked the mysterious forces of the underworld, entities neither named nor fully understood, whose power was feared but respected. But cursed tablets were not confined to personal vendettas. Entire communities used them, inscribing pleas against invading armies or requesting the misfortune of rival cities. They were tools of collective will, carrying the weight of many voices unified in purpose. Beyond the cursed tablets, funerary texts held their own haunting power. These inscriptions, often found on tomb walls, were not created in haste. They were crafted with the utmost care, their purpose extending far beyond the grave. They served as guides for the dead, maps to navigate the treacherous landscape of the afterlife. But they were also shields, armed with words to ward off those who would dare disturb the eternal rest of the departed. In one tomb, the walls whisper a chilling warning: "He who enters this tomb shall be cursed. His heart shall be taken, his breath extinguished, his flesh devoured." The words are not meant to frighten the casual observer, but to ensure that the sanctity of the resting place remains untouched. They are commands to the living and promises to the dead. The texts were not always so dire. Many were poetic, speaking of reunions with loved ones in the afterlife or of the joys awaiting the soul in the field of reeds. But even in these moments of beauty, there lingered an edge of caution. For in ancient Egypt, death was not the end, it was a continuation, a world just as complex and fraught as the one left behind. Some funerary texts contain spells of retaliation. Should the tomb be disturbed, these spells would unleash chaos upon the intruder. Thieves who dared to steal treasures would find themselves stricken with blindness, illness, or misfortune. The objects within the tomb were not just possessions, they were imbued with protective magic, ready to defend their owner even in death. One such object, a statuette buried with a noblewoman, bore an inscription so precise it seemed alive. "I am the watcher of this tomb," it read. "If you take what is not yours, may the jackal haunt your dreams and the scorpion find your hand." It was both a curse and a declaration, a reminder that even inanimate objects were not without power in this land of magic and belief. The creation of these texts and objects was a sacred act. Priests, scribes, and magicians worked tirelessly to ensure that every word, every symbol, every placement carried the weight of its purpose. The ink used was often mixed with precious substances, symbolizing the importance of the task. Papyrus was treated with reverence, its surface a canvas for the eternal. These artifacts, whether cursed tablets or funerary texts, were more than relics. They were windows into the souls of those who created them. They spoke of pain and hope, love and vengeance, faith and fear. Each one a story waiting to be told, a life captured in the permanence of stone and lead. Even now, as they are unearthed from the sands, their power lingers. The words etched so long ago still carry the echoes of their creator's intent, a reminder that in ancient Egypt, words were never just words, they were the fabric of reality, capable of shaping the seen and unseen alike. The desert was silent, but it felt alive. The sand shifted underfoot, whispering secrets to the wind. Above, the sun burned mercilessly, yet within the newly unearthed tomb, the air was thick and still, as though time itself had paused. The year was 1922, and the world's attention had been drawn to the Valley of the Kings. Howard Carter, after years of relentless searching, had uncovered the final resting place of a boy king, Tutankhamun. The first crack in the tomb seal was like the opening of a forbidden door. Carter held a flickering candle as his team stared into the darkness. "Can you see anything?" Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's patron, whispered. Carter's reply would become legendary: "Yes, wonderful things." Gold glinted in the dim light, statues, treasures, and the untouched history of a life long forgotten. But it wasn't the gold that would haunt them. It was something far less tangible, something the world would soon call a curse. Not long after the discovery, strange occurrences began to stir rumors. It started with Carnarvon. He died unexpectedly, only months after entering the tomb. The official cause was blood poisoning from a mosquito bite, but whispers of supernatural vengeance spread faster than the truth. They said his death was no accident, that the boy king's wrath had reached across the centuries to punish him for his intrusion. And then there were the other stories. A cobra, sacred to the Pharaohs, was said to have slithered into Carter's home and devoured his canary, a chilling omen. Others involved sudden illnesses, mysterious accidents, and untimely deaths among those connected to the expedition. Each tragedy added another thread to the web of fear surrounding Tutankhamun's tomb. The newspaper seized the story, feeding the public's hunger for the eerie and unexplained. Headlines screamed of the curse of the pharaoh, and articles painted Tutankhamun as a vengeful spirit guarding his eternal rest. Readers devoured every detail, convinced that the tomb held a power beyond human comprehension. But beneath the hysteria, there was a quieter truth. Many who worked closely with the tomb lived long, uneventful lives. Howard Carter himself, the man who had first breached the tomb's seal, lived for another 16 years, passing away in his bed at the age of 64. His death bore no signs of curses or mysterious forces. Still, the curse refused to be dismissed. Its grip wasn't in the facts, but in the fear it evoked. People needed to believe in it. Perhaps it was easier to think of the tragedies as divine punishment rather than the randomness of life. Perhaps it was comforting, in a strange way, to imagine that the ancient Egyptians still held power in a world that had moved on without them. In truth, the so-called curse likely had less to do with supernatural forces and more with human imagination. The tomb, sealed for millennia, was a breeding ground for mold and bacteria. Exposure to these elements could have caused the illnesses that befell some of the tomb's visitors. But even this explanation lacked the drama and mystique that people craved. The idea of a curse held a kind of poetic justice. It made Tutankhamun more than a king. It made him a guardian, a figure whose reach extended far beyond his years. His name, forgotten for so long, now echoed in every corner of the world. The tomb itself seemed to breathe with an energy that defied reason. Stepping inside was like stepping into a world frozen in time. The walls, adorned with vivid paintings, spoke of a life lived in the shadow of gods. The treasures, carefully arranged, reflected a desire to carry beauty and power into the afterlife. And yet, there was an undercurrent of fragility. Tutankhamun had died young, his reign cut short, his legacy incomplete. Perhaps that was the true curse, the tragedy of a life unfulfilled. The treasures weren't just riches, they were remnants of a boy trying to hold onto his place in the world, even in death. To disturb them was to disturb that fragile attempt at permanence. The stories of the curse lingered, growing and twisting with each retelling. They became a part of Tutankhamun's legacy, as enduring as the artifacts themselves. Even now, as the treasures of his tomb are displayed in museums, the shadow of the curse hangs over them, a reminder of the fear and wonder that his discovery inspired. And so, in the quiet of the tomb, where the gold gleams and the walls whisper of ancient prayers, the boy king waits. Not in anger, but in a silence that speaks of a time when words and beliefs had the power to shape the world. And perhaps, if you listen closely, you can hear it, the faint echo of a curse, not born of malice but of the unyielding desire to be remembered. The moon hung low over Giza, its pale light casting eerie shadows on the sand. In the stillness of the night, the Great Pyramid of Khufu loomed like a silent sentinel, its immense stones speaking of an age when men dared to touch the heavens. The air felt heavy, almost alive, as if the pyramid itself was breathing. To those who approached, it was more than a monument, it was a force, ancient and untouchable. Legends whispered that this structure, the pride of a mighty pharaoh, was no mere tomb. It was said to be a fortress of power, protected not by guards but by something far more mysterious. Those who dared to trespass spoke of inexplicable sensations, a crushing weight in the chest, a chill that crept through their bones, and the unshakable feeling of being watched. Some claimed the pyramid stones hummed softly at night, a sound that wasn't heard but felt, resonating deep in the soul. The stories of its defenses began to grow as swiftly as the shadows it cast. An expedition in the late 19th century reported strange occurrences. A guide, bold enough to venture too close, fell ill and passed away within days. His companions swore they had heard whispers in the desert wind that night, words in a language none of them understood. They left hurriedly, the golden treasures they had hoped to find forgotten in their haste. Some called it a curse, others a warning. The pharaoh Khufu, they believed, had commanded the gods themselves to guard his eternal rest. The Great Pyramid wasn't just a testament to his power, it was a trap, a labyrinth of energies meant to ensnare anyone foolish enough to disturb it. Stories spread of explorers losing their way inside, their lanterns extinguished by unseen hands, leaving them to wander the cold, suffocating darkness. One account told of a man who, defying warnings, tried to climb to the very top of the pyramid. Halfway up, he froze, unable to move. He described a force pushing him back, as though the stones themselves rejected his presence. He was found hours later, trembling and muttering prayers to gods he did not believe in. For centuries, there have been whispers about the pyramid's core, a chamber said to hold more than Khufu's remains. Some believe it is a repository of divine power, capable of controlling life and death. Others speak of sacred inscriptions within, words so potent they could bend reality. The pyramid, they say, is more than a tomb, it is a gateway, a barrier between the mortal world and something far greater. In the late 20th century, technological advancements brought a new wave of curiosity. Scientists, armed with radar and infrared, attempted to peer inside the Great Pyramid without disturbing its stones. What they found was as baffling as it was unsettling. Hidden voids, inexplicable energy readings, and chambers that seemed to defy logic. One researcher claimed that standing near the pyramid's heart made her feel weightless, as though the very air around her had shifted. The workers who built the pyramid left no written records, only the stones themselves. But those who have stood in its shadow speak of an overwhelming presence, a feeling that the pyramid is not silent but watching, waiting. There are tales of visitors who fainted upon entering its chambers, their minds flooded with visions of an age long past, images of priests chanting, rituals performed under the stars, and a pharaoh commanding the forces of the cosmos. The Great Pyramid has seen empires rise and fall, its secrets guarded through millennia. Yet, for all its grandeur, it remains an enigma. Perhaps that is its greatest power, not the stones or the treasures within, but the questions it leaves unanswered. Even today, as the pyramid stands stoic against time, those who approach feel a sense of unease. It is not fear, exactly, but reverence. A recognition that they are in the presence of something far beyond their understanding. The desert may shift, the winds may howl, but the pyramid endures, unyielding and eternal. And somewhere within its colossal walls, the spirit of Khufu watches, his legacy immortal, his power unbroken. The sun set over the Nile, its golden rays painting the water in shades of fire. In the distance, the great statues of Amenhotep III stood in silent majesty, their faces carved with a confidence that could only come from a ruler whose name echoed through eternity. But as the light faded, the shadows lengthened, creeping up the colossal figures like an omen, and the stories whispered by the desert winds became harder to ignore. It is said that Amenhotep III ruled in an age of splendor, a time when the gods seemed to favor Egypt above all lands. The temples gleamed with offerings, the cities thrived under his gaze, and the people praised his name as the Sun King. Yet, even in this golden age, there was a warning, a faint rumble beneath the surface of the grandeur. For those who betrayed the will of the gods, those who dared to challenge the sanctity of Amenhotep's reign, there would be no mercy. There are tales of workers who disappeared while constructing the great monuments of his time. Whispers spread among them of strange occurrences, tools vanishing in broad daylight, stones cracking without cause, and eerie voices that seemed to come from the very earth beneath their feet. Many believe these were not mere accidents, but signs of the pharaoh's divine wrath, unleashed on those who failed to honor their duty. One story tells of a man, a sculptor of extraordinary talent, who dared to mock the likeness of the pharaoh while crafting his statue. That night, the man's cries pierced the stillness of Thebes. His neighbors found him trembling, his eyes wide with terror. He claimed the statue had turned its gaze upon him, its stone lips curling into a silent snarl. By morning, he was gone, leaving behind only his tools and the unfinished statue, its face forever etched with a scornful expression. The priests of Amenhotep III were said to wield immense power, channeling the pharaoh's connection to the gods. They performed rituals that bound his enemies to curses so terrible they defied comprehension. These curses were not always immediate, some lingered, like a shadow that grew darker with each passing day. There is a legend of a foreign dignitary who refused to kneel before the pharaoh, declaring his own king superior. He returned to his homeland, only to find his city consumed by fire, his family struck by illness, and his name erased from history. The wrath of Amenhotep III extended beyond his lifetime. When his tomb was opened centuries later, those who disturbed it were said to be met with strange and terrible fates. Some fell ill with diseases that baffled physicians, their symptoms defying any known cure. Others reported nightmares so vivid they feared sleep itself, dreams of being trapped in an endless desert under the unforgiving gaze of the sun. One haunting tale speaks of an archaeologist who discovered a golden amulet inscribed with Amenhotep's name. She wore it as a token of her success, marveling at its beauty. That night, she awoke to find her room bathed in an unnatural light. A figure stood at the foot of her bed, its face shrouded but its presence undeniable. The amulet grew hot against her skin, and she tore it off, flinging it across the room. By morning, it had vanished, and she refused to speak of the incident again. The pharaoh's monuments themselves seemed to carry his essence, his power imbued in every stone. Travelers who dared to touch the statues often spoke of an overwhelming force, a sensation of being judged. Some claimed to hear whispers in the ancient language of Egypt, words they could not understand but felt deep in their souls. These experiences left them shaken, as though they had glimpsed a fraction of the pharaoh's might. Amenhotep's wrath was not reserved for individuals alone, entire lands were said to suffer under his curse. During his reign, a neighboring kingdom betrayed a sacred alliance, seeking to undermine Egypt's dominance. The pharaoh's retaliation was swift and unrelenting. Their fields withered, their rivers dried, and their people were plagued by a relentless drought. When emissaries came to beg for mercy, they were met with silence. The kingdom fell into ruin, its name lost to time, a testament to the consequences of defying a living god. Even now, the legacy of Amenhotep III casts a long shadow. His statues, though weathered by time, remain unyielding, their presence a reminder of a ruler who commanded not just armies but the very forces of nature. Those who stand before them speak of an unshakable feeling, as if the pharaoh is still watching, his eyes hidden but his gaze inescapable. The tales of his wrath may be dismissed as myth, yet they persist, whispered by the wind and etched in the hearts of those who dare to listen. And as the sun sets over the Nile, casting its golden light one last time before darkness falls, the statues of Amenhotep III remain, guardians of an age when even the gods bowed to a mortal king. The moon hung heavy over the sands of Egypt, its pale light casting eerie shadows across the crumbling ruins of Deir el-Bahari. In the heart of the ancient mortuary temple, whispers seemed to echo in the stillness, faint and unsettling. They carried no language, only the weight of a presence that could not be denied, a presence many believed belonged to Hatshepsut, the pharaoh who defied convention and claimed a throne meant for kings. Her story was one of triumph, but her revenge? That was a tale laced with fear. Long after her reign ended, the name of Hatshepsut was struck from the records, her statues defaced, her achievements buried beneath layers of stone and silence. But legends whispered that her spirit would not rest, that her wrath lingered in the air like an unseen storm, waiting for the ones who dared erase her. It was said that those who dishonored her memory would pay a price not in gold, but in their very souls. A scribe once recounted the tale of a priest who attempted to desecrate an altar dedicated to her. He believed himself safe, protected by his own rituals, and scoffed at the warnings of his peers. Yet as his hammer struck the stone, a strange chill swept through the chamber. The air grew thick, the faint scent of lotus blossoms mingling with something acrid and sour. He froze, his heart racing, and for a moment, it seemed as though the walls themselves were closing in. The next day, he was found wandering the desert, his mind fractured, his voice muttering prayers to an unseen queen. Centuries later, when archaeologists unearthed artifacts bearing her name, strange incidents began to unfold. Tools would go missing, only to reappear in inexplicable places. Workers complained of unseen hands brushing against them, faint whispers curling in their ears. One man, a seasoned excavator, swore he saw a figure in royal regalia standing atop the temple's broken columns. She gazed at him with eyes that burned like embers, her expression one of unyielding authority. He fled, abandoning his post and refusing to return. Hatshepsut's revenge, it was said, was not always swift. It was patient, deliberate, like the queen herself. One story tells of an ambitious historian who sought to discredit her achievements, dismissing her as a usurper unworthy of her crown. He spent years unraveling her legacy, only to fall victim to a string of misfortunes. His health deteriorated, his reputation crumbled, and his family distanced themselves, claiming he had become a man haunted by shadows. On his deathbed, he whispered her name with a mix of awe and dread, as though he finally understood the force he had underestimated. The myths speak of a queen who was not only a ruler but a force of nature, a woman who wielded her power with grace and determination. To cross her was to invite a reckoning that transcended time. Some say her curse extends to those who tread too lightly on the truth of her reign, who fail to honor her as she once was, a pharaoh who ruled not as a mere placeholder, but as Egypt's rightful sovereign. An eerie tale from the 19th century describes an English nobleman who acquired a relic from her temple, a small, intricately carved figure believed to represent the queen herself. He displayed it proudly in his home, but soon strange occurrences began to plague his household. Objects would move on their own, his dogs would howl at empty spaces, and a faint but persistent tapping could be heard late at night. The nobleman fell ill, consumed by dreams of a regal woman standing at the foot of his bed, her gaze heavy with reproach. He returned the relic to Egypt, desperate for peace, and the disturbances ceased. Those who step into the ruins of her temple today often report an indescribable sensation, as though they are being watched. Some describe it as a comforting presence, others as an oppressive weight. There are moments when the wind seems to carry a voice, soft but firm, a voice that demands to be remembered. Hatshepsut's legacy was one of resilience, of breaking barriers and defying expectations. But the myths suggest that her spirit, unbowed in life, remains vigilant in death. It is a presence that commands reverence, a force that cannot be erased. Those who dare to dismiss her, to diminish her memory, find themselves entangled in her enduring wrath, a reminder that a queen does not simply fade into obscurity. A queen endures. The old man's hands trembled as he unrolled the brittle papyrus, its edges flaking under the slightest touch. The ancient script seemed alive, the ink shimmering faintly in the dim light of his oil lamp. He had searched for decades, following whispered clues and cryptic maps that led him to this forgotten chamber beneath the sands. And now, as the symbols of Thoth, the god of wisdom, magic, and writing, unfurled before him, a strange weight pressed upon his chest. This was no ordinary text. This was the scroll of Thoth, and the air around it felt heavy with something far older than time. Legend spoke of the scroll in hushed tones, warning of the curses etched into its fibers. It was said to hold the secrets of life and death, spells that could summon gods or unleash plagues upon the world. Those who read it did not merely invite danger, they beckoned the wrath of forces beyond human comprehension. But desire often eclipses fear, and many had sought its power, each meeting an end as chilling as the stories themselves. The first recorded tale came from a priest of Ra who claimed to have found the scroll locked away in a sacred temple. He dared to read its forbidden lines, hoping to wield the magic it promised. Witnesses said he emerged from the temple hours later, his skin pale as alabaster, his eyes staring into an unseen abyss. He spoke only once before his voice fell silent forever. The words are alive. They see. He died within days, his body withered as though consumed by an invisible fire. Centuries later, a merchant stumbled upon fragments of what was believed to be the same scroll in a market along the Nile. He dismissed the warnings of the vendor, laughing off the notion of curses. That night, his home caught fire without cause, the flames devouring everything except the scroll. The fragment was found intact among the ashes, untouched by the inferno. The merchant's family, grieving and terrified, cast it into the river, praying the waters would carry the curse far away. But the scroll, it was said, could not be destroyed. It always found its way back. Another story tells of a French scholar during Napoleon's expedition to Egypt. Obsessed with ancient texts, he discovered the scroll hidden in the ruins of a collapsed tomb. He claimed it whispered to him as he studied it, the words shifting beneath his gaze. He translated one line before his mind fractured completely. The pen of Thoth writes not in ink, but in fate. He spent his remaining years in an asylum, carving incomprehensible symbols into the walls, his screams echoing through the halls on moonlit nights. Even the scroll's guardians were not spared. A grave robber who stumbled upon its hiding place took it, thinking it would fetch a high price. Within hours, his companions began falling ill, their skin marked by strange blackened lines as though the scroll itself had reached out to claim them. The robber, desperate and panicked, buried the artifact in the desert. But his attempt to escape the curse failed. His body was found days later, his face frozen in an expression of unspeakable terror. The scroll's most chilling tale comes from the 20th century, when an archaeologist named Evelyn Reed reportedly uncovered it during a dig in Luxor. Unlike others, she did not scoff at the warnings. She approached the scroll with a mix of reverence and fear, reading only enough to document its existence. But even her cautious respect could not shield her from its grasp. Her journal, recovered after her disappearance, contained a single haunting entry: the words speak louder in the dark. I fear I have heard too much. She was never seen again, though some claim to hear whispers in the night around her excavation site, faint and insistent. The Scroll of Thoth was not merely a text, it was a threshold, a connection to realms where mortals were not meant to tread. Those who encountered it described an almost sentient presence, as though the scroll knew them, weighed their intentions, and decided their fate. The very act of touching it was said to mark a person, an invisible tether binding them to its curse. For centuries, scholars have debated whether the scroll was real or a story born from collective fear. Yet those who stood before it, who dared to read even a single line, all shared the same fate. It was not the words themselves that destroyed them, it was what lay within the words, the unseen force they summoned, the curse that lingered in the spaces between the letters. The Scroll of Thoth was not merely read, it was experienced. And those who experienced it were forever changed. The wind whispered through the Valley of the Kings, carrying with it an eerie chill that seemed to seep into the bones. Nightfall cloaked the ancient tombs in shadow, and the desert seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of the unseen forces lying in wait. These were not just burial places, they were fortresses of power, wrapped in legends that had survived the sands of time. The dead here were not at rest. Their guardians were said to be watching, and their curses, as the stories went, were more than mere words. A group of workers, decades ago, had been digging in the valley when they uncovered a hidden passage. The air inside was stale and heavy, and a faint, inexplicable sound echoed through the darkness. They pressed on, their lanterns flickering, until they stumbled upon the entrance to an unmarked tomb. Above the doorway was an inscription, crudely translated by one of the men: "Whoever disturbs this place shall feel the breath of death." Some laughed it off, while others hesitated, but the promise of treasure pushed them forward. Days later, the first man who had entered fell mysteriously ill. His skin turned pale, and his body trembled as if gripped by an unseen hand. He whispered of shadows moving in the night before slipping into a fevered delirium. By morning, he was gone. His companions dismissed it as coincidence, until the others, one by one, began to meet similar fates. The most infamous tale speaks of Lord Carnarvon, who funded the excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb. Days after the tomb was opened, Carnarvon was bitten by a mosquito. The wound became infected, and he died suddenly of blood poisoning. It said that the exact moment of his death, all the lights in Cairo went out, as though darkness itself mourned his passing. Rumors spread that Carnarvon had ignored warnings etched within the tomb, curses meant to protect the boy king from the living. Even Howard Carter, the archaeologist who led the discovery, was not untouched by the whispers of doom. Though he lived for years after the find, many around him were struck by strange and untimely ends. A cobra, a symbol of protection for the pharaohs, was said to have killed Carter's pet canary on the very day Tutankhamun's tomb was opened. Locals claimed this was no mere accident, it was a warning, a sign that the pharaoh's guardians were stirring. Stories of curses were not limited to Tutankhamun. In another tomb, an inscription was found carved into the wall: "Death will come on swift wings to those who disturb the eternal rest." The first archaeologist to study the tomb returned to his home country shortly after the discovery. Within weeks, he died in his sleep, his face contorted in a look of terror. His assistant, who had also entered the tomb, was found lifeless days later under similarly mysterious circumstances. Some of the most chilling accounts come not from those who excavated the tombs, but from those who dared to steal from them. Grave robbers, drawn by the promise of gold and riches, often met grisly fates. One story tells of a group who unearthed treasures from a hidden chamber late one night. They celebrated their find, dividing the loot among themselves. By morning, their camp was silent. When locals went to investigate, they found the men sprawled across the ground, their bodies twisted and lifeless. The treasures they had stolen were gone, as though reclaimed by invisible hands. Another tale speaks of a young boy who stumbled upon a piece of jewelry near one of the tombs. He brought it home to his family, unaware of the curse attached to it. That night, a terrible storm tore through their village, though the skies had been clear just hours before. The boy's home was struck by lightning, and all within perished. Locals whispered that the Pharaoh's wrath had followed the artifact, claiming all who dared to take what was not theirs. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of these curses is not the deaths themselves, but the way they seem to linger, like an unseen force watching from the shadows. Workers in the valley often reported hearing faint voices echoing through the tombs, whispers that grew louder the deeper they ventured. Tools would disappear, only to reappear in strange places. Some claimed to see figures moving in the corners of their vision, shadows that dissolved when they turned to look. A guard stationed near one of the tombs spoke of waking in the middle of the night to find his torch extinguished. The silence was oppressive, broken only by a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. When he relit the torch, he saw nothing but the empty desert before him. Yet, the tapping continued, as if coming from within the tomb itself. These curses were not idle threats. They were warnings, woven into the very fabric of the valley's history. Whether they were the work of ancient magic or simply the weight of guilt and fear manifesting in strange ways, the effect was undeniable. The Valley of the Kings, with its silent tombs and endless secrets, was a place where the living and the dead shared an uneasy coexistence. Those who dared to enter knew one thing: the guardians of these tombs were patient. And they never forgot. The chisel struck stone, each blow echoing through the dimly lit chamber. An ancient scribe carefully etched the words, his hand steady despite the weight of their meaning. The air was thick with the scent of earth and sweat, the silence punctuated by the scratch of tools carving eternity into limestone. The scribe paused, his fingers hovering over the unfinished curse. He knew these words were not mere warnings, they were guardians, the only thing standing between the eternal rest of the Pharaoh and those who would dare to disturb it. The curses inscribed within these tombs were not made for the faint of heart. They spoke of dire consequences, death, madness, and suffering for any who defied their warnings. He who violates this tomb, read one inscription, may his heart be devoured by Ammit, and his soul wander aimlessly through the darkness. These words were not written lightly. They carried the weight of belief, a belief so strong that it could crush even the bravest spirits. Centuries later, archaeologists and adventurers would stumble upon these inscriptions, their lanterns casting flickering light over the ancient warnings. Some dismissed them as superstitions, relics of a time long past. Others, however, felt an icy grip tighten around their hearts as they read. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way they seemed to echo in the mind, growing louder the longer they lingered. For some, it was as if the dead were whispering directly to them, their voices filled with quiet rage. The psychological weight of these curses was profound. Imagine standing alone in the suffocating darkness of a tomb, your breath shallow as you read the words meant for intruders like you. Your rational mind might tell you it's nonsense, but a small, primal part of you cannot shake the feeling that you are being watched. That same part of you remembers the countless stories of those who ignored such warnings and paid the ultimate price. In one such story, a French explorer in the 19th century found himself face to face with a curse carved into the entrance of a forgotten tomb. It warned of disease and despair, promising that the violator's name would be erased from the book of life. Laughing off the threat, he pressed forward, his torch illuminating treasures untouched for millennia. Within weeks, he was dead. His colleagues whispered about the curse, and though none dared speak it aloud, they all wondered if the tomb's warning had reached beyond the grave. Sometimes, the mere act of reading these warnings was enough to instill dread. A worker in the Valley of the Kings once stumbled upon an inscription that spoke of a slow and painful demise for intruders. He laughed nervously as he read it, but that night, he awoke in a cold sweat, his mind replaying the words over and over. He refused to return to the site, convinced that the curse had already begun its work on him. The effectiveness of these curses lay not only in their words, but in the fear they planted. Fear has a way of growing, of taking root in the deepest corners of the mind. It starts as a whisper, "What if the curse is real?" and grows louder with every shadow, every unexplained sound. In the stillness of the tomb, with only the weight of the ages pressing down on you, that fear becomes impossible to ignore. The ancient Egyptians understood this well. They knew that a curse didn't have to kill to be effective. It only had to linger, to make the violator question every breath, every movement. Was the faint cough the start of an illness? Was that shadow on the wall just a trick of the light? The human mind, left to its own devices, would do the rest. One chilling account tells of an archaeologist who defied the warnings etched into a tomb's walls. The curse spoke of betrayal by those closest to him, a slow unraveling of his life. At first, he laughed it off, but as the years passed, he found himself haunted by misfortune. Friends turned against him, his health deteriorated, and his career crumbled. He became convinced that the curse was real, that it had sunk its claws into his very soul. Whether it was mere coincidence or the curse taking its toll, no one could say. The guardians of the tombs did not discriminate. Robbers, archaeologists, and even innocent bystanders who touched the artifacts were said to fall victim to their wrath. One story tells of a child who picked up a small amulet near a tomb's entrance. That night, he became feverish, muttering incoherently about golden lights and cold hands. The fever passed, but the boy was never the same. His laughter faded, replaced by a quiet fear that shadowed him for the rest of his life. These curses were more than just threats, they were extensions of the pharaohs themselves, a final line of defense against the world of the living. To those who believed, they were as real as the tombs they guarded. To those who didn't, they were reminders of human fragility, of the way our minds can twist and turn in the face of the unknown. Even now, standing before an ancient tomb, it's hard not to feel the weight of those words. They stare back at you from the stone, cold and unyielding, their meaning clear: leave this place, or suffer the consequences. The silence around you grows heavier, the air colder, as if the guardians of the past are still watching, waiting to see if you dare to cross the line. And in that moment, it doesn't matter whether you believe in curses or not. The fear is real, and it is enough. The priest's hands trembled slightly as he raised the sacred tool, its polished surface gleaming under the flickering light of oil lamps. Shadows danced across the painted walls of the tomb, where scenes of eternal life were meticulously etched in vibrant colors. The air was thick with the scent of incense, curling upwards like ethereal fingers reaching for the heavens. Silence enveloped the room, broken only by the whispered chants of those gathered. Every word carried weight, a bridge between the world of the living and the dead. Before them lay the still body of the departed, carefully prepared and adorned for the journey into eternity. His face was serene, yet the aura of his presence seemed to demand reverence. This was no mere body, this was a vessel for a soul destined to meet the gods. The priest stepped closer, holding the tool steady. With deliberate precision, he touched it to the mouth of the departed, a gesture so ancient it felt as though time itself paused to bear witness. The opening of the mouth ritual was more than a ceremony, it was a lifeline to eternity. It was believed to restore the senses of the deceased, granting them the ability to speak, see, hear, and breathe in the afterlife. Without it, the soul would wander aimlessly, lost in the void. But there was another layer to this ritual, one that made the air hum with tension. For just as it could grant blessings, it was whispered that it could summon curses upon those who failed to perform it with purity and respect. Legends tell of priests who faltered in their duty, their hearts unclean, their minds tainted with doubt or greed. One tale speaks of a priest who, driven by envy, performed the ritual for a powerful nobleman with ill intent. His chants faltered, his movements clumsy, as his hidden malice seeped into the sacred words. That night, the nobleman's tomb was filled with unearthly cries, echoing through the stone corridors. By morning, the priest was found lifeless, his face frozen in an expression of unspeakable terror. His body bore no wounds, yet it was as though something had reached out from the other side to silence him forever. There were those who believed that the ritual not only connected the living to the dead but also opened a doorway, one that could swing both ways. Stories circulated of unseen presences lingering in the chambers where the ritual was performed. Attendants spoke of cold drafts brushing against their skin, of whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Some even claimed to see fleeting shadows in the corner of their vision, disappearing the moment they turned to look. The tool itself, often shaped like a small adze or spoon, held immense power. It was said to carry the essence of Ma'at, the principle of truth and harmony, but when wielded improperly, it could invoke chaos. In one chilling account, an apprentice priest accidentally dropped the tool during a ritual. The clang of metal against stone reverberated like a thunderclap, and the atmosphere in the tomb shifted. The air grew colder, the flickering flames dimmed, and a low, guttural sound filled the chamber. The apprentice fled, abandoning the ceremony, and was never seen again. Even when performed flawlessly, the ritual was not without its risks. It required absolute focus and faith, for the boundary between life and death was fragile. Witnesses often described an almost electric tension in the air as the priest's chants reached their crescendo. In those moments, it felt as though the walls themselves were listening, the painted eyes of gods and guardians watching intently. To falter was to invite disaster, to succeed was to touch the divine. But what of the soul for whom the ritual was performed? It was believed that their presence lingered, hovering near their body, waiting to see if the ritual would grant them passage to the afterlife. If the ceremony was done with sincerity, the soul would find peace. But if it was botched or tainted, the soul might become restless, trapped between worlds. Such souls, it was said, often returned to seek justice or vengeance. One haunting tale recounts the story of a wealthy merchant whose family commissioned the opening of the mouth ritual. The priest, driven by greed, demanded an exorbitant fee and rushed through the ceremony without care. That night, the merchant's widow awoke to the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through her home. She followed the sound, her heart pounding, only to find the figure of her husband standing in the doorway. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, his mouth open as though trying to speak. The widow fainted, and when she awoke, the house was silent once more. The priest, however, was not so fortunate. He was found the next morning, his body contorted as though he had struggled against an invisible force. The ritual's power lay not only in its ability to connect the soul to eternity, but also in its ability to hold a mirror to the living. It demanded purity of heart, for any trace of deceit or malice could turn its blessings into curses. The weight of this responsibility often left priests visibly shaken, their faces pale and their hands trembling as they performed the sacred act. Some described feeling as though they were being judged, not by the gods, but by the soul they sought to aid. There is a quiet beauty in the ritual, a tenderness in the way it seeks to bridge the gap between life and death. Yet, beneath that beauty lies an undercurrent of danger, a reminder that even the most sacred acts carry the potential for darkness. In the stillness of the tomb, surrounded by the whispers of eternity, the opening of the mouth ritual stands as a testament to the power of belief and to the delicate balance between blessings and curses. The torchlight flickered against the stone walls, casting long, wavering shadows over the intricate carvings. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint crackle of the flame. Each step into the tomb felt heavier, as though unseen eyes watched every move. And then, there it was, inscribed boldly in ancient hieroglyphs, a warning, sharp and unyielding. The words seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, their meaning transcending time. Death will come on swift wings to him who disturbs the eternal sleep of the king. These words, etched with meticulous care, were not merely warnings. They were promises. Spells of protection, woven into the fabric of eternity, guarded the resting place of a pharaoh. Each symbol carried the weight of belief, every stroke a binding pact with forces unseen. To trespass here was not only to invite wrath, but to awaken powers that cared nothing for moral courage or greed. The ancient Egyptians understood the fragility of the afterlife. They knew the line between this world and the next was thin, so thin that a single misstep could disturb the balance. For a pharaoh, whose journey to immortality was paramount, there could be no room for error. These rulers were not only kings, they were gods in human form, their spirits destined to ascend and rule alongside the divine. Their tombs were not merely graves, they were sanctuaries, fortresses imbued with enchantments to repel the unworthy. One spell, inscribed on a royal sarcophagus, spoke directly to the intruder. I will seize your breath. I will snatch away your life. The crocodile in the river shall eat your flesh, and the lion in the desert shall devour your bones. The words were not poetic musings, they were a call to the forces of nature, an invocation for the world itself to rise against those who dared defile the tomb. Stories abound of those who ignored these inscriptions, their arrogance sealing their doom. In the whispers of history lies the tale of a tomb robber who dared to enter the burial chamber of a forgotten king. He mocked the warnings, his laughter echoing through the stone halls. But as he reached for the treasures, his torch extinguished, plunging the chamber into darkness. Panic gripped him, his breathing ragged as he fumbled for light. The silence around him grew heavy, oppressive, as though the air itself had turned against him. When his companions found him hours later, his lifeless body lay contorted on the floor, his face frozen in terror. There was no wound, no mark of violence, only the lingering scent of something ancient and angry. The power of these spells lay not only in the supernatural but also in the fears they instilled. The inscriptions spoke directly to the soul, reaching into the deepest recesses of the mind. They invoked imagery so vivid, so horrifying, that even the bravest heart could falter. A curse written in the tomb of Seti, I warned, he who breaks the seal of this tomb will burn with the fire of the sky and drown in the waters of the abyss. The words conjured visions of storms and floods, of celestial vengeance and endless despair. There were those who believed the curses were alive, feeding off the energies of the tomb. The spells were not mere words, but living entities, guardians bound to the resting place of their master. They waited silently, their power dormant until disturbed. And when awakened, they unleashed fury, an unstoppable force that sought to restore order. Even in modern times, the echoes of these protective spells linger. When Howard Carter unearthed the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, the world was awestruck by the treasures within. But what followed was a series of mysterious deaths that fueled speculation about the pharaoh's curse. Among the inscriptions found in the tomb was a chilling reminder, "Cursed be those who disturb the rest of the king. They shall suffer death by a disease that no doctor can cure." Skeptics dismissed the curse as superstition, attributing the deaths to natural causes or coincidence. But for those who believe, the curse was a testament to the enduring power of the spells. Even after millennia, the words retained their potency, their ability to reach across time and strike fear into the hearts of those who dared to trespass. In the dim light of the tombs, the protective spells take on a life of their own. The hieroglyphs seem to shimmer, their edges glowing faintly as though infused with the essence of the gods. Each symbol is a key, a lock, a barrier against the chaos that threatens to seep in. The walls themselves hum with an energy that cannot be explained, an invisible force that guards the sanctity of the space. The pharaohs trusted in these spells, believed in their power to protect them in death as they had been protected in life. They understood that immortality was not a gift, but a responsibility, one that required vigilance even in the afterlife. And so, they inscribed their warnings, their curses, their invocations, not out of malice but out of necessity. For those who heed the warnings, the tombs remain silent, their guardians undisturbed. But for those who ignore the ancient words, the consequences are as inevitable as the rising sun. The spells stand eternal, a testament to the enduring power of belief and the unyielding will of the pharaohs who refused to be forgotten. The village square was quiet, the air heavy with an uneasy stillness. A broken pot lay in the dust, its sharp edges glinting under the harsh sun. Whispers spread like wildfire, the villagers' faces marked with dread. It wasn't the pot that unsettled them, it was the faint inscription etched along its rim. Words of warning, carved with intent, curled like a snake ready to strike. He who steals this vessel will find his body cursed. His blood will turn to fire, and his name will be erased from the living. The curse was not extravagant, not adorned with royal grandeur or divine wrath. It was simple, direct, and terrifying. And it wasn't aimed at kings or tomb raiders, it was meant for ordinary men and women. In a land where belief ran as deep as the Nile, even the humblest person wielded the power of words to protect what was theirs. Curses weren't reserved for pharaohs or priests. They bled into the daily lives of farmers, craftsmen, and merchants. Everyday objects bore these ominous warnings: pots, tools, even door frames. A fisherman might inscribe his net with a curse against thieves. A farmer might guard his granary with words meant to summon sickness upon any who dared to steal. These inscriptions weren't decoration, they were shields, as vital as the tools themselves. In the shadow of the temples, where gods and mortals intertwined, people sought divine power to enforce their curses. The gods of justice, Maat and Anubis, were frequently invoked. A woman protecting her loom might appeal to Maat, "May she who takes this thread weave misery into her life." A merchant safeguarding his wares might call upon Anubis, "Let the thief's hands wither as they touch what is not theirs." But curses didn't always protect material goods. Some were etched into the earth itself, carved on the stone markers of graves. For commoners, burial was no less sacred than for the elite. The body was the vessel for the soul's eternal journey, and any disturbance threatened this delicate balance. One gravestone bore a chilling inscription: "Disturb this resting place, and the jackals will feast on your heart. Your soul will wander, never finding peace." These were not idle threats. To violate a grave was to invite the unending torment of the unseen. The power of these curses lay in their belief. To the ancient Egyptians, words carried life, and once spoken or written, they became eternal. A simple phrase, etched with intent, could summon forces beyond human comprehension. It wasn't just the threat of punishment that made these curses effective, it was the conviction that the punishment was inevitable. The stories whispered in villages were enough to keep even the most daring in line. There was the tale of a potter who ignored a curse inscribed on a rival's kiln. He laughed as he broke the seal and took the clay within. But as he shaped his stolen goods, his hands began to tremble uncontrollably. By the next morning, they were swollen and useless, his once thriving trade reduced to dust. Another story told of a man who stole grain from a cursed granary. He filled his sack under cover of night, but as he returned home, the sack seemed to grow heavier. By the time he reached his door, the weight crushed him to the ground. When his neighbors found him the next morning, his sack was empty, its contents scattered back toward the granary as if reclaimed by unseen hands. Curses for commoners didn't rely on elaborate rituals or priestly invocations. They were born from raw emotion, anger, fear, desperation. A mother might curse the path of a man who harmed her child, her words laced with a fury that seemed to hang in the air long after she spoke them. A scorned lover might whisper a curse into the wind, believing it would find its mark. These curses were personal, intimate, and as much a part of life as the rising sun. Even the tools of justice bore curses. In some communities, disputes were settled by invoking curses to determine guilt or innocence. A man accused of theft might be made to swear an oath over a cursed object, the belief being that the guilty could not escape the punishment promised by the inscription. If he lied, his crops would fail, his cattle would sicken, or his family would suffer. The mere presence of such an object often brought trembling confessions. But curses were not always dark. They were layered, complex, and sometimes intertwined with blessings. A craftsman might curse a tool to ward off thieves while simultaneously inscribing a blessing for its user: "Let this hammer bring strength to the honest hand, but may the dishonest one find it heavy as a mountain." It was a balance of protection and goodwill, a reflection of the interconnectedness of life and faith. For the common people, curses were a way to claim control in a world filled with uncertainties. They were a language of power, a means to assert their worth in a society where the divine often seemed reserved for the elite. Through curses, they wove their fears, hopes, and anger into something tangible, something lasting. In the quiet corners of Egypt, where life revolved around the rhythms of the Nile, these curses lingered, etched into stone, clay, and wood. They were the echoes of lives lived with passion and conviction, their words a testament to a belief that no act, no word, and no intention ever truly disappeared. The torch flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the ancient stone walls. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of dust and decay. A group of men stood at the entrance of a tomb, their faces lined with greed and fear. They had braved the desert night for this: gold, jewels, treasures that could change their lives forever. But as the leader stepped forward, his hand trembling on the cold stone door, his eyes froze on the inscription carved into its surface. "Death will come on swift wings to him who disturbs this eternal rest." The words seemed to pulse with life, their meaning burning into his mind. He turned back to the others, his voice shaking. "It's just words," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But no one moved. The silence was louder than any protest. They had heard the stories, the whispers that filled the night. Tomb robbers who had vanished without a trace. Men who had returned home only to fall ill, wasting away in agony, as if the gods themselves had reached into their lives and snatched the breath from their lungs. Curses were not mere warnings. They were promises, etched in stone, meant to be fulfilled. Pharaohs and priests wielded them like weapons, a final defense against the inevitable greed of the living. To the Egyptians, tombs were sacred spaces, gateways to eternity. The treasures within were not riches to be plundered, they were tools for the afterlife, offerings to ensure a safe passage to the world beyond. To disturb a tomb was not just theft, it was desecration, an act of violence against the divine order. The inscriptions guarding these tombs were written with purpose, their words chosen to invoke dread. "The crocodile will devour you. The serpent will coil around your throat. Your children will weep, for you will never see another dawn." These were not vague threats, they painted vivid, horrifying pictures that sank into the soul. The curses did not just promise physical harm, they targeted the spirit, the Ka and Ba, threatening eternal torment that no amount of wealth could outweigh. The men in the desert knew this. And yet, the lure of gold was powerful. One by one, they stepped inside, their breaths shallow, their movements slow. The walls seemed to close in on them, the hieroglyphs watching with silent judgment. One of them laughed nervously, breaking the tension, but the sound died quickly, swallowed by the tomb's oppressive stillness. As they reached the burial chamber, the leader's eyes gleamed. The sarcophagus lay before them, its lid adorned with intricate carvings of gods and pharaohs. But his attention was drawn to another inscription. It spoke not just of death, but of something worse: "He who dares to disturb this king's sleep will know the suffering of 1,000 lifetimes. His body will rot, his soul will be cast into darkness, and his name will be erased from existence." The others hesitated, their greed warring with their fear. The leader pressed forward, his hands gripping the lid. "It's just words," he repeated, though his voice cracked. With a grunt, he pushed, the heavy stone groaning as it slid aside. The air grew colder, as if the tomb itself was exhaling a breath it had held for centuries. They worked quickly, filling their sacks with gold and trinkets, but the feeling of unease never left. One of them stopped, his hand hovering over an amulet. "Don't touch that," another hissed. "It's a protection charm." The first man hesitated, his fingers brushing the surface. A scream pierced the silence as he recoiled, clutching his hand. Blood dripped from his palm, though no blade had touched him. Panic set in. The men scrambled to leave, their treasures forgotten. But the tomb seemed to stretch endlessly, its passages twisting and turning as if mocking their escape. When they finally stumbled out into the desert, the sun was rising, but its warmth did little to calm their racing hearts. The leader looked down at his hands. They were unmarked, but they trembled uncontrollably. Days passed, and the curse hung over him like a shadow. He tried to convince himself it was superstition, a trick of the mind. But then the nightmares began. Every night, he dreamed of the pharaoh, his eyes burning with fury. "You have stolen my eternity," the king would whisper. "Now I will take yours." The others fared no better. One fell ill, his body wasting away despite the efforts of the village healer. Another was found wandering the desert, his mind shattered, muttering the same phrase over and over, "The wings of death, the wings of death." The leader's fate was the most tragic of all. Consumed by guilt and fear, he returned to the tomb, hoping to return what he had taken. But the tomb's entrance was gone, swallowed by the shifting sands. He cried out, begging for forgiveness, but the desert offered no reply. His body was found days later, lifeless and broken, the inscription from the tomb etched into his skin as if by an unseen hand. These stories were not just cautionary tales, they were warnings passed down through generations. The belief in curses was so strong that even those who doubted their power dared not test them. To rob a tomb was to gamble with more than one's life, it was to risk the wrath of the gods and the eternal torment of the soul. The tombs of Egypt stood as monuments to this belief, their walls bearing the weight of prayers, warnings, and curses. They were not just resting places for kings and queens, they were battlegrounds between the sacred and the profane, where the living dared to challenge the divine and often paid the price. And as the sands of time covered these tombs, the curses remained, waiting, eternal as the gods who had written them. The sun dipped below the horizon, its last rays staining the desert a deep crimson. In the heart of the temple courtyard, shadows stretched long and dark, flickering like restless spirits against the ancient walls. The air was heavy with the scent of burning incense, sharp and intoxicating. A single priest stood at the altar, his robes flowing like water, his face an unreadable mask. Before him, an animal, a goat, its fur as white as the moonlight, trembled in quiet fear, its wide eyes glinting with the reflection of the brazier's flames. The moment was charged, thick with anticipation. Every breath, every rustle of fabric, seemed louder than it should be. The crowd, silent and tense, watched as the priest raised his ceremonial blade, its edge gleaming like a shard of lightning. This was not an act of cruelty. To them, it was something far more profound, a sacrifice to the gods, an offering to fuel the power of a curse that would bind the guilty and protect the sacred. When the blade descended, the silence shattered. The goat's cry pierced the night, raw and unfiltered, echoing through the temple as its life ebbed away. Blood spilled onto the altar, rich and warm, pooling into grooves carved into the stone. The priest whispered incantations, his voice low and rhythmic, weaving words into a spell as old as time itself. The blood, they believed, was not mere fluid, it was life force, potent and brimming with energy. It carried the essence of the living, a gift that bridged the mortal world and the divine. The flames in the brazier roared higher, as if fed by an unseen wind. Those gathered around shuddered, clutching their amulets and muttering prayers under their breath. The offering had been accepted. The gods had been stirred. Now, the curse would take root, its tendrils spreading unseen through the air, seeking its target with a relentless, otherworldly precision. Animal sacrifices were never performed lightly. Each life given was considered sacred, its purpose profound. The Egyptians believed that the act of sacrifice amplified the potency of a curse, infusing it with a raw, untamed energy. It was not enough to speak the words of a curse or inscribe them on stone. They had to be charged with something living, something powerful enough to carry the weight of the spell into the world. In some ceremonies, the choice of the animal was as significant as the act itself. A serpent for treachery, its sinuous body a mirror of deceit. A bull for strength, its power turned against the enemy. A bird for the soul, its wings carrying the curse to its mark. The animal became a vessel, its life force mingling with the incantations, transforming words into a force that could not be denied. But these sacrifices were not always grand, temple-bound affairs. Sometimes, they were intimate, hidden under the veil of night. A simple villager, wronged and desperate, might offer a chicken to the gods, its blood spilled on the threshold of their home. The curse spoken in those moments was no less potent, fueled by the raw emotions of the one who uttered it. Anger, sorrow, betrayal, these were the true ingredients of a curse, their intensity magnified by the life that was given. There was a story told in whispers, passed from one generation to the next, about a farmer who had lost everything, his crops, his livestock, his family, because of a rival's treachery. One night, under the pale light of the stars, he stood before a makeshift altar, clutching a small lamb in his arms. He had raised the creature from birth, and his tears fell freely as he whispered his curse. May his fields wither as mine have. May his house crumble, his children turn against him, and his name be forgotten. The lamb's blood stained the soil, and the farmer fell to his knees, trembling with the weight of what he had done. Months later, the rival's fortunes turned. His crops failed, his wealth vanished, and he died alone, his name erased from the memory of his village. Some said it was coincidence, the natural turn of fate. But those who had seen the farmer's grief, who had felt the weight of his curse, knew otherwise. In the hands of the priests, the ritual was more refined, more controlled, but no less visceral. The curses they cast were inscribed onto amulets or walls, etched into eternity. The sacrifices they made were offerings to the gods, yes, but they were also warnings. To defy the gods was to invite ruin, to invite the curse that would haunt your every step, your every breath. The blood on the altar was a symbol, a reminder that life itself could be the price of arrogance, of greed. And yet, the curses were not always born of vengeance or punishment. Sometimes, they were acts of protection, shields against the chaos of the world. The life given was not taken in anger, but offered in devotion, a plea for safety, for peace. The sacrifice was a bond, an agreement between the mortal and the divine, sealed with blood and fire. The night after a sacrifice was always still. The air seemed heavier, the stars sharper, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Those who had witnessed the ritual carried its weight with them, a mix of awe and unease. They would speak of the flames, the blood, the words that lingered in the air long after the priest's voice had fallen silent. They would wonder if the curse had already begun to move, invisible but unstoppable, weaving its way toward its mark. The priest, too, would feel it. As he washed the blood from his hands, he would hear the echoes of his own voice, the weight of the words he had spoken pressing against his chest. He would look at the altar, at the empty space where life had once been, and he would know that something had changed. Something had been set in motion, a force that could not be undone. In the quiet of the temple, as the last of the incense burned away, the priest would kneel before the gods, his head bowed, his heart heavy. He would pray not for forgiveness, but for understanding. The curse had been cast, the offering made. The rest was up to the gods. The scroll felt fragile in her hands, its ancient papyrus crinkling softly as she unrolled it. The faint light of the oil lamp cast shadows that seemed to dance across the hieroglyphs, each symbol imbued with a strange, quiet power. Her breath hitched as her eyes landed on the first line, a plea to the gods, raw and desperate, for safe passage through the unknown. This was no ordinary text. It was a map, a lifeline, the only shield against the chaos waiting beyond death. The Book of the Dead, they called it, though it was far more than a book. It was a guide for the soul, a voice in the darkness whispering how to navigate the treacherous paths of the afterlife. Death was not an end, it was a transition, a journey fraught with trials. The Egyptians knew this well. They believed the afterlife was a mirror of life, filled with rivers to cross, gates to pass, and gods to appease. But the afterlife was also a realm of uncertainty, of unseen dangers lurking in the shadows. A misstep could mean eternal wandering or worse, a fate so unspeakable it made the living shudder just to think of it. The words on the scroll were not just instructions, they were spells, protections woven into poetry. They carried the weight of centuries, written and rewritten by those who had walked the edge of mortality. Each line pulsed with urgency, as if the scribes themselves had known the terror of the unknown. O Osiris, judge of the dead, grant me your mercy. May my heart be pure as Ma'at decrees. For the soul of the deceased, the heart was everything. It was more than flesh, it was the record of their life, the keeper of their truth. And in the hall of Ma'at, it would be weighed against the feather of truth. If it was found wanting, if it tipped the scales, the punishment was swift and final. The devourer goddess, Ammit, waited hungrily nearby, her crocodile jaws ready to consume the unworthy. The thought of facing her made even the most stoic shiver. The scroll gave instructions for this moment. Speak no falsehoods, carry no guilt, for the gods know all that you hide. It provided the soul with words to calm the gods, to stand firm before their piercing gaze. But words alone were not enough. The heart had to be light, free of the burdens of sin and deceit. As she continued reading, her fingers trembling slightly, she came to the spells meant to ward off curses. These were not curses cast by the living but by the afterlife itself. There were rivers of fire, serpents coiled with venom, and gates guarded by deities who demanded the correct answers to pass. Hail to you, who guards the seventh gate. I bring no harm, I carry no malice. Open the way, that I may walk into the field of reeds. The field of reeds, it was the promise at the end of the peril. A place of peace, where the soul could live in harmony, surrounded by loved ones, free from the pain of mortality. But to reach it, one had to survive the trials. The scroll provided spells for every conceivable obstacle. For crossing the river, it invoked the power of Hapi, the god of the Nile. For facing serpents, it called upon Ra, the sun god, to burn them with his light. But it was not only the external threats the soul had to overcome. The most terrifying dangers came from within: doubts, fears, regrets. These were the whispers that could unbalance the scales, that could poison the heart. The scroll acknowledged this too. O my soul, do not betray me. Stay true, stay light, for we walk this path together. One story spoke of a scribe who had prepared his own book of the dead, inscribing every spell with painstaking care. He believed himself ready for the afterlife, his heart pure, his intentions noble. But when he stood in the hall of Ma'at, his heart wavered. A single moment of doubt tipped the scales. Amit's jaws closed around him, and his name was erased from the world of the living. The lesson was clear: faith in the spells was as important as the spells themselves. The scribe's failure was a warning, but there were tales of triumph as well. A young woman, buried with a modest book of the dead, had faced the afterlife's challenges with courage. She had recited the spells with unwavering conviction, her heart steadfast. When she reached the field of reeds, the gods themselves were said to have smiled. The book of the dead was not just for the wealthy or the priests. Its power lay in its universality. Even the simplest soul, armed with its words, could navigate the afterlife's labyrinth. But it required belief, a surrender to the ancient wisdom etched into its lines. Her eyes lingered on a final passage, one that seemed to pulse with life even in the dim light. O gods of the afterlife, I come before you with truth in my heart and courage in my soul. Guide me, protect me, for I seek only peace. She traced the hieroglyphs with her finger, feeling the weight of those who had written and spoken these words before her. They were not just words, they were a bridge, a promise that even in the face of death, there was hope. As the oil lamp flickered, the room seemed to grow colder. She rolled the scroll back up with care, her heart heavy yet strangely light. It was a paradox she couldn't explain, the way the Book of the Dead could fill her with both dread and comfort. It was a reminder of the fragility of life, the inevitability of death, and the resilience of the human spirit. The chamber was silent, a stillness so heavy it seemed to press against the chest, making every breath feel like a struggle. Torches burned on either side of the grand hall, their light casting long shadows that danced across the stone walls. At the center stood an enormous scale, its arms gleaming like gold in the flickering light. It wasn't just a scale, it was a gateway, a reckoning, a moment that decided everything. The soul stood before it, trembling, unable to speak. Surrounding them were the gods, their eyes unblinking, their presence overwhelming. To one side, Ma'at, the goddess of truth and balance, held her feather, a single plume so light it seemed to defy gravity. To the other, Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead, waited patiently. His hands rested on the scale, steady and sure, as though he had performed this ritual 1,000 times. And then there was the heart. It lay in the center, small and vulnerable, but pulsing with invisible power. It was not just flesh and blood, it was the sum of everything the soul had been. Every choice, every thought, every secret that had been carried in life was now exposed. The heart did not lie, it could not lie. It was the keeper of truth, the silent witness to a life lived. The air felt colder as Anubis raised his hand, signaling the moment had come. The soul's knees buckled slightly, but they stood their ground, their eyes darting between the feather and the scale. The silence was shattered by a soft creak as the heart was placed on one side of the scale. It quivered as though alive, its weight more than physical. Mayat stepped forward, her movements graceful yet deliberate. She placed her feather on the other side of the scale, and the chamber seemed to hold its breath. The gods watched, their faces unreadable. The soul closed their eyes, unable to bear the sight. Time stretched, each second a lifetime of anticipation. And then, the scale tipped. For a moment, it was unclear in which direction. But as the feather began to rise, dread washed over the soul like icy water. The heart was too heavy. It weighed down the scale, dragging it lower and lower, as if the very sins it carried were pulling it into the abyss. A whisper of air swept through the hall, chilling and final. Anubis did not look at the soul. His hand gestured, and a monstrous figure stepped forward from the shadows. It was Ammit, the devourer, a creature unlike anything the soul had seen in life. She was part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, a terrible fusion of the wildest predators. Her eyes gleamed with hunger, and her jaws opened slightly, revealing rows of sharp teeth. The soul fell to their knees, their cries echoing in the vast hall. They begged, pleaded, tears streaming down their face. But the gods remained silent, unmoved. This was justice, impartial and unyielding. The soul's heart had failed the test, and there was no escape. Ammit drew closer, her movements slow and deliberate, savoring the fear that radiated from the condemned. The soul tried to crawl away, but the shadows of the gods surrounded them, blocking every path. As Ammit's jaws snapped shut, the chamber grew dark, and the soul's cries were silenced forever. But not every weighing ended in despair. Some hearts were light, unburdened by the weight of wrongdoing. In those moments, the scales balanced perfectly, the feather and heart equal in their weight. The gods would nod in approval, and a warmth would fill the hall. The soul would feel it too, a peace that was almost overwhelming, a sense of release as though chains had been broken. Anubis would then guide the soul to the next stage of the afterlife, his presence no longer intimidating but comforting. The field of reeds awaited, a paradise where the soul could reunite with loved ones, basking in eternal harmony. The weighing of the heart was a test, yes, but it was also a mirror. It reflected not just deeds but intentions, the truths hidden beneath the surface. It was a moment of reckoning that every soul had to face. There were no second chances, no way to cheat or deceive. The God saw everything, knew everything. And the scale, impartial and unerring, revealed the soul's truest self. The air was thick, stifling, pressing down on the soul like a weight they couldn't shake. All around, there was darkness, not the comforting stillness of night, but an oppressive void, where shadows seemed to pulse with life. This was the Duat, a place where the living could not tread, where the dead faced trials that would decide their eternity. It was said to stretch endlessly, an ever-shifting labyrinth of terrors and wonders. The soul stepped forward, trembling. With every hesitant move, the ground beneath them shifted like sand, loose and treacherous. A distant sound echoed, low and guttural, a growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They froze, their breath hitching in their chest, straining to listen. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. Ahead, faint shapes emerged, flickering like mirages. Spirits, pale and gaunt, drifted aimlessly. Their faces twisted in eternal torment, their hollow eyes staring into nothingness. They had been judged unworthy, their hearts too heavy to pass the scales. Now, they wanted to do it, cursed to an existence of endless suffering. Their whispers rose like a cold wind, chilling and mournful, telling tales of regret and despair. The soul wanted to run, but where? There was no escape, no map to guide them through this treacherous realm. And then it came, a voice, low and ancient, speaking from the shadows. "Who are you to walk this path?" it demanded, each word a rumble that vibrated in the soul's bones. They turned slowly, and there it was. A figure, half hidden in the gloom, its form shifting and indistinct. It was not human, its body coiled and stretched unnaturally, its eyes glowing with a light that pierced the dark. This was no mere spirit, it was one of the cursed entities, a guardian of the underworld, a creature born of vengeance and fear. "Answer," it hissed, moving closer. The soul tried to speak, but their voice failed them, swallowed by the weight of their terror. The creature leaned in, its breath hot and sour, carrying the stench of decay. It raised a clawed hand, pointing to the path ahead. "If you are worthy, you will walk this road. If not," it let the threat hang in the air, its meaning clear. The path twisted and turned, a narrow trail flanked by rivers of fire and water. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though unseen hands were pulling the soul back. The ground began to shift again, this time splitting apart. From the cracks, skeletal hands emerged, clawing at the air, reaching for the soul. They grasped at their ankles, cold and relentless, pulling them down. The soul screamed, struggling against the hands, their panic rising. But just as the grip tightened, a sudden light appeared, a golden glow that pushed back the shadows and sent the cursed spirits retreating into the darkness. The soul looked up to see a figure robed in gold, holding a staff that shimmered like the sun. It was Ra, the sun god, protector of those who sought redemption. His presence was a fleeting comfort, but it was enough to give the soul strength to continue. The journey through the Duat was not over. The light faded as quickly as it had come, leaving the soul alone once more. Ahead, the river widened into a black lake, its surface unnaturally still. A boat waited on the shore, its wooden frame ancient and creaking. The soul climbed aboard, the oars moving by themselves, propelling the vessel forward. The water rippled, and shapes began to rise from its depths. Faces, twisted and grotesque, stared up at the soul. They were the drowned, those who had failed to navigate the waters of the Duat. Their voices rose in a cacophony of screams and moans, their hands slapping against the sides of the boat, trying to pull it under. The soul clutched the edges, their knuckles white, praying for the boat to reach the other side. When it did, the shore was unlike anything the soul had seen. It was barren, the earth cracked and dry, littered with bones that crunched underfoot. A figure loomed in the distance, its outline massive and imposing. As the soul approached, they saw it was a statue of Osiris, the lord of the underworld. His eyes seemed to follow them, unblinking and cold, as though judging their every move. And then, the final trial came. A gate appeared, its surface shimmering with strange symbols. It was said that only the worthy could pass, and those who tried and failed would be devoured by the cursed entities guarding it. The soul hesitated, their heart pounding. Behind them, the whispers grew louder, the cursed spirits closing in. They could feel their icy breath on the back of their neck, hear the scrape of their claws against the ground. The soul stepped forward, reaching for the gate. As their hand touched its surface, a blinding light erupted, engulfing everything. For a moment, there was nothing, no fear, no pain, only silence. And then, the gate opened. The storm came without warning. The sky, once a serene canvas of gold and azure, turned a menacing shade of black. Thunder cracked like the roar of a beast, shaking the earth to its core. And then came the winds, howling with a fury that seemed alive. Crops were ripped from the ground, homes crumbled, and the terrified screams of villagers were lost in the chaos. They whispered his name in fear, Set, the god of storms, chaos, and violence. He was not a deity of gentle rains or guiding winds, he was destruction incarnate, a force that tore through order and left ruin in its wake. When Set's wrath descended, it was not just nature that suffered. His anger seeped into the hearts of men, twisting their souls with greed, envy, and betrayal. Legends told of those who dared to provoke him, fools who challenged his might or disrespected his sacred offerings. Their fates were etched into the memory of the land. One man, a proud and arrogant chieftain, had mocked Set during a feast, claiming that no god could break his will. That night, a great serpent slithered into his chambers, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It struck with the speed of lightning, sinking its fangs into the man's chest. By dawn, his body was found lifeless, his face contorted in a silent scream. Yet Set's vengeance was not always swift. Sometimes it festered, like a wound that refused to heal. There was a story of a prosperous merchant who denied Set his due during a festival, offering spoiled grains as tribute. For years, the merchant thought he had escaped punishment, growing richer and more powerful. But then, one by one, his ships sank. His fields withered under relentless heat. His children fell ill, wasting away despite every remedy. By the time the merchant realized his folly, it was too late. He begged for forgiveness at Set's altar, but the god's answer came in the form of a sandstorm that buried the merchant's estate, erasing him from history. If Set's rage was a tempest, Sekhmet's fury was fire. The lioness-headed goddess of war and healing was as merciless as she was revered. She could heal the gravest wounds, but her anger could burn nations to ash. When humanity displeased her, Sekhmet did not merely punish, she annihilated. In one tale, an arrogant king sought to outshine Sekhmet by building a temple in his name larger than hers. It was said he mocked her in private, boasting that no goddess could match his glory. Sekhmet heard his insolence, and her wrath was swift. She descended upon his kingdom in the form of a lioness, her roar shaking the heavens. The air grew thick with the stench of blood as Sekhmet tore through the land, sparing no one. Her rage only ceased when the gods themselves intervened, tricking her with vats of dyed beer that she mistook for blood. Drunk and pacified, Sekhmet retreated, leaving behind a land reduced to ruins. But even when her anger subsided, Sekhmet's curses lingered. In another tale, a healer betrayed her by using her sacred herbs for personal gain, selling cures meant to be gifts from the goddess. Sekhmet, enraged by this betrayal, cursed the healer with an eternal sickness. No remedy, not even her own, could ease the agony. The healer lived out her days writhing in pain, her cries a warning to all who dared to misuse the gifts of Sekhmet. Other gods, too, wielded curses as their weapons. Sobek, the crocodile-headed god of the Nile, was both protector and punisher. His waters nourished the land, but they could also drown those who disrespected him. It was said that Sobek's curse would take the form of crocodiles, silent hunters that dragged their prey into the depths, leaving only ripples behind. And then there was Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification and the afterlife. Though not known for anger, his punishments were chillingly precise. Those who tampered with the dead or desecrated tombs often found themselves haunted by jackals. Their howls filled the night, driving the guilty to madness. Perhaps the most harrowing tale of divine punishment belonged to Isis. The goddess of magic and motherhood, Isis was often merciful, but her vengeance was terrifying. When a priest betrayed her trust by using her spells for evil, she cursed him with a voice that would never stop speaking. Day and night, the priest's own voice echoed in his ears, a constant stream of guilt and regret. Unable to sleep, unable to silence the torment, he wandered the land until his mind broke completely. These were not just stories told to frighten children. They were warnings, etched into the hearts of the faithful, a reminder that the gods were always watching. Their wrath was not random, it was a response to disrespect, arrogance, and betrayal. To anger a god was to gamble with one's very existence, a risk few were willing to take. The people lived in both fear and reverence, knowing that the gods' curses were not merely punishments. They were lessons, harsh and unforgiving, meant to teach humility and devotion. And as the storms raged, the fires burned, and the jackals howled, the people prayed, not just for protection, but for forgiveness. For they knew that in the eyes of the gods, no sin went unnoticed. The fire never stops. It crackles and spits, sending embers that burn your skin, but they don't heal. They never heal. It's not just the heat that stings, it's the suffocating weight of the guilt that presses down on you, heavier than any chain. You try to scream, but the air is thick with smoke, choking the words before they can escape your lips. Everywhere you look, shadows writhe. Faces, twisted, familiar, and yet so distorted, stare back at you, their eyes burning with the same torment that now consumes you. These are the souls that once walked the earth with pride, greed, and hatred, and now they are trapped, forever entangled in their own guilt. This is where they come to rot, and you, too, will rot here, bound by the curses that cling to your soul. The fires are not the only punishment. There are deeper horrors. The ground beneath you shifts constantly, as if even the earth itself cannot bear to hold your weight. It buckles, twists, and cracks open, swallowing you whole, only to spit you back out, broken and bruised. The endless cycle of falling and rising keeps you awake in ways sleep can never offer. The weight of every sin, every wrong, presses against you like a mountain, and each time you think you've caught your breath, the pressure builds again. You never escape. You never rest. This is the place where those who lived without remorse are brought to face the consequences of their actions. A place where the punishment is as eternal as the torment. It is not a quiet, peaceful darkness, it is alive with the sound of screaming, of pain, of regret. The spirits that wander these cursed lands can never rest. They are condemned to relive their sins, over and over, each moment worse than the last. One spirit stands apart from the rest, unable to escape the memories of a lifetime wasted. He had been a man of great wealth and influence, but his power came at the expense of others. He had crushed those who were weaker, left people to die when he could have saved them. His eyes now scan the desolate wasteland around him, but it doesn't matter where he looks. All he sees is the face of the child he turned away when she begged for food, the face of the old woman he ignored when she asked for help crossing the street. The guilt is an unrelenting tide that threatens to drown him over and over again. The more he tries to run from it, the closer the faces come. They whisper, accusing, reminding him of every wrong, every moment where he could have been better, and yet he chose to be cruel. There is no escape. There never will be. Another spirit, a woman, writhes in the corner of the land. She was once a priestess, dedicated to the gods, but her devotion was a lie. She had sought power, not purity. She had used her position to manipulate others, to take what she wanted, regardless of the consequences. In her eyes now is the look of someone who knows what she has lost, but still cannot understand the magnitude of her betrayal. Every whisper in her ear, every breath she takes, is filled with the voices of the people she betrayed. They are never silent. They echo in her mind, reminding her of the prayers she ignored, the sacrifices she made in the name of selfishness. The weight of her lies crushes her chest, and no matter how much she begs, the gods who once adored her have turned their faces away. These are not the worst fates, though. There are worse things that await those who lived lives marked by cruelty and hate. In the darkest corners of this torment, there are creatures, beasts that haunt the shadows, feeding on the fear of the condemned. They are hungry, always hungry, and the souls they pursue are their meals. These are not beasts of flesh and bone, but shadows given form, born of the deepest fears that a soul can possess. The more you fear them, the more they grow. They grow until they consume you whole, and once they're done, there is no trace left of who you were. But the true terror is not the beasts or the fire. It is the eternal loneliness. The knowledge that you will never again touch the world you left behind, the world that you took for granted. The families you abandoned, the friends you betrayed, the love you tossed aside, all of it is lost to you forever. The world moves on without you. The living forget you, and you are left with nothing but your sins, replaying in an endless loop. You watch as time passes, but it doesn't change. There is no end to the suffering. No morning light to bring hope. The very idea of rest, of peace, becomes foreign to you. In this place, the soul is not allowed to rest. There is no calm, no peace. Only the weight of your own actions, crushing down on you like 1,000 stones. For some, the guilt of their past sins is enough to break them, to tear them apart in ways that no fire, no beast, no curse ever could. They beg, they cry, but it is too late. The chance to repent is gone, and they are left with nothing but the unending nightmare of their own soul. This is the fate of the wicked. This is the price for those who lived without compassion, who sowed cruelty and hate into the world. Their punishment is eternal, stretching out beyond the boundaries of time itself. There is no escape, no way to bargain with the gods. There is only the endless torment of their own making. They are not forgotten, not abandoned. They are merely the echoes of a life lived poorly, suffering for every second they denied kindness, every second they ignored the cries of those around them. The torment continues forever. The sound of footsteps echoed through the dark, hollow tomb. They were too quiet, too careful. But in the silence of the ancient stone chambers, the faintest sound could be the last. A thick, oppressive air clung to everything, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. No one had entered this place in centuries, maybe more. The explorers who came before, their names lost to time, had found themselves ensnared by a curse older than the kingdom itself. The tales of their fates whispered through the ages, warnings for anyone who dared disturb the tombs of the forgotten. One story spoke of a man named Gerald, a young, ambitious archaeologist with a thirst for discovery. He wasn't the first to attempt to unlock the secrets of the tomb, but he was the most determined. With a heart full of pride and a mind that believed nothing could stand in his way, he ventured into the tomb, armed with tools and an unshakable belief that he could overcome whatever dangers lay inside. But the deeper he went, the heavier the air became. The walls seemed to press in, and every step he took was met with an unnatural silence. His heart raced, but he couldn't stop now. He had come too far, and the treasures that awaited him, ancient relics and untold riches, were just within reach. He had read the warnings. He had seen the curses described in dusty, forgotten texts, but he thought they were just superstitions. No one had ever truly proven that the ancient gods of this place were real. As Gerald reached the burial chamber, a cold wind blew through the narrow corridors, even though there was no sign of an opening. It wasn't a draft, something was moving, something unseen. His fingers tightened around the tools in his hands, and he moved forward, more cautious now. His light flickered, casting long, eerie shadows against the stone. And then, he saw it. The sarcophagus, old and weathered, stood at the center of the chamber. It was beautiful, but in a way that felt wrong. The carvings on its surface seemed to move when he looked away, shifting into shapes he couldn't quite understand. He didn't hesitate. He pried open the sarcophagus, his breath coming in short gasps. What he found inside was not treasure. No gold, no jewels. Instead, there was a figure, a body, perfectly preserved by the ancient magic of the tomb. But it wasn't just a body. The eyes, wide open, seemed to follow him as if it were alive. And then, a voice, low, guttural, whispered through the chamber, "You should not have come." Gerald froze. His body stiffened, his breath caught in his throat. But it was too late to turn back. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble, and the walls seemed to close in on him. The tomb was alive, and it was angry. In the weeks that followed, Gerald's expedition team returned to the site to search for him. His notes were scattered, his belongings abandoned, but there was no trace of him anywhere in the tomb. The only thing they found was his journal, its pages filled with frantic, desperate scribbles about eyes that followed him, whispers in the dark, and the feeling of being suffocated by an invisible force. The last page was a single word, written in a trembling hand: help. Some say Gerald's spirit still roams the tomb, trapped forever by the curse he unwittingly unleashed. Others believe the earth swallowed him whole, taking him into the very depths of the underworld he had disturbed. But no one ever saw him again. No one except the occasional unlucky soul who wandered too close to the cursed tomb. It wasn't just Gerald. There were others, brave explorers, some even famous for their daring pursuits, who met a similar fate. They thought they could outsmart the old gods, break their curses with modern tools and technology. They didn't realize that they were no match for the ancient magic that had stood the test of millennia. One such explorer, a man named James, entered the tomb with the goal of proving it was all nonsense. There was no curse, no ancient vengeance. Just stories to scare off the weak-hearted. He laughed at the warnings, scoffed at the superstitions. The moment he set foot inside, the air seemed to change. It wasn't that cold at first, but it was thick, heavy with something he couldn't name. His torchlight flickered, as if the flames themselves feared what lay within. The deeper James went, the more the walls seemed to close in, narrowing until he had to crawl through tight passages, as if the tomb itself were alive and pushing him toward something. He kept telling himself it was just his imagination, but the feeling, the oppressive weight of something ancient and wrong, gnawed at his every thought. His mind played tricks on him, making him hear whispers and feel unseen hands brushing against his skin. At the heart of the tomb, he found a chamber unlike any he had seen before. The floor was covered in ancient symbols, symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. He knelt down to study them, unaware of the danger. The moment his fingers brushed against the stone, something inside the walls clicked, and the entire tomb began to shake. The air grew colder, and a voice echoed from the depths, a low growl that sent chills down his spine. "You shouldn't have touched that," the voice whispered. James stumbled backward, but it was too late. The tomb had marked him, and as he turned to run, the walls closed in around him, trapping him in an endless maze. No one ever saw James again. The only trace of him was the same strange symbols he had written in his own journal, symbols that no one could decipher, but that everyone knew meant one thing: he had become part of the curse. The tombs that these men sought to plunder were not just resting places. They were warnings. They were sentinels of a power far beyond the understanding of mortal men. Those who disturbed them were marked, bound to the curse of the ancient gods. And the curse was relentless, never letting go, forever lingering in the shadows of their ill-fated ambitions. The stories of these early explorers live on in hushed whispers, and the kind of voices that tremble when the wind howls too fiercely. The curse doesn't need proof. It only needs belief. And for those who dared to defy it, their fates were sealed. They are the ones who wander the tombs now, ghosts in the dark, trapped forever by their own greed. The crackling of a dying fire was the only sound as the men huddled together in the flickering shadows. It was deep in the heart of Egypt, in the deserts where the sun left its mark on everything it touched. They were on the brink of discovery, their eyes gleaming with excitement. But that was before they found the tomb, the one that had remained sealed for centuries. The air inside the tomb had felt thick, as if the very walls held their breath, watching. Each breath they took felt colder than the last. They pushed forward, lifting the massive stone door, unaware that by doing so, they had disturbed something ancient, something dark. The ancient curse wasn't just a story, it was real. It had been waiting, and now it was free. The first archaeologist to enter the tomb was named Arthur. His reputation had grown over the years, his name whispered in academic circles as a pioneer, someone who could push past the limits of what was known. Arthur's excitement was palpable as he made his way deeper into the tomb, unearthing relics that had not seen the light of day for millennia. But even as he marveled at the treasures around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air had a weight to it, pressing against him, urging him to leave. His breath grew shallow, but he ignored it, too eager to uncover more. When Arthur found the sarcophagus, the whispers began. At first, it was just a hum, a vibration that ran through the walls. He couldn't make it out, but it was there, like a song sung in a language he couldn't understand. He opened the sarcophagus anyway, revealing a mummified figure that had been preserved in a perfect, unnerving state. The eyes, those eyes, they seemed to stare into him, into his very soul. He recoiled, but before he could step back, the tomb began to shake, as though the earth itself was angry at being disturbed. Arthur's men rushed in to help him, but when they touched the sarcophagus, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The men were paralyzed, as if an invisible force had locked them in place. And then, the curse took hold. One by one, Arthur's team was claimed. The first to go was Thomas, his heart giving out from sheer terror, though no one could explain why. Then Edward, struck down by a fever so fierce it burned his skin, his body twitching uncontrollably in the nights that followed. And then the others, each falling victim to an unseen hand that seemed to be everywhere at once. Arthur, too, was claimed in the end. His fate was more horrific than anyone could have predicted. It was said that his body was found days later, but it wasn't his body anymore. It was something else, twisted, deformed, as though it had been manipulated by some terrible force. His once proud face was frozen in a mask of terror, eyes wide open, as if the very last thing he had seen had been something he couldn't comprehend. As the years passed, the story of Arthur and his ill-fated expedition became just one of many whispered among archaeologists. It wasn't the first to be told, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. In the 19th century, the tale of another expedition echoed through the halls of museums and private studies. This time, it was a man named Howard. He had heard the stories, of course. The ancient curse that had claimed so many before him. But Howard was different. He wasn't afraid of old legends and ancient superstitions. No, he had a reputation to uphold, a career to make. He would be the one to prove them all wrong. Howard and his team unearthed a tomb that had been buried beneath the sands for centuries, untouched by time. He opened the entrance with a smug grin on his face, as though daring the curse to show itself. But as the tomb opened, a chill swept over the men. The temperature dropped so quickly that their breath fogged in the air. They looked at each other, unease creeping into their bones, but Howard laughed it off. He told them they were being foolish, that nothing would happen. But they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they ventured deeper into the tomb, it became clear that they had made a grave mistake. The walls seemed to close in around them, and strange symbols were etched into the stone, glowing faintly as they passed. And then, the voices began. They were soft at first, barely a whisper, but as they moved deeper, the voices grew louder, more distinct. They spoke of death, of vengeance, of curses that stretched beyond the veil of life and death. Howard ignored it all, determined to find the tomb's treasure. But when he came across a hidden chamber filled with gold and jewels, something stirred. It wasn't a physical presence, but a dark force that hung in the air. The temperature plunged again, and the walls seemed to pulse with life. Howard didn't notice at first, too busy collecting his treasure. He didn't see the shadows moving just out of sight, the cold creeping into his bones. One by one, Howard's team began to falter. Some fell ill, their skin turning ashen and cold. Others simply disappeared, their screams echoing through the tomb before falling silent. Howard couldn't understand what was happening. It was as if the tomb itself had come alive, pulling them deeper into its grasp. In the end, Howard was the last to go. His body was found outside the tomb days later, but there was no sign of what had taken him. His eyes were wide open, and his mouth hung agape, frozen in a scream that no one could hear. The treasure he had sought was gone. The curse, it seemed, had claimed him too. The legends didn't end there. As the 20th century approached, the world saw more and more archaeologists tempted by the ancient tombs of Egypt. Some believed they were immune to the curse, that they were smarter, better prepared. They were wrong. In the early 1900s, another group of archaeologists ventured into a tomb, following in the footsteps of those who had gone before. They, too, were never seen again. Some say the tomb claimed them all, their bodies never to be recovered. Others believe they met a fate worse than death, one that lingers in the shadows, whispering to those who dare listen. Each expedition added another layer to the myth, another piece to the puzzle. The curse wasn't just a story, it was a reality, an undeniable force that claimed those who dared disturb the ancient tombs. The echoes of those who had fallen reached out to warn others, but no one listened. The temptation of what lay hidden in the dark was too strong. The consequences? Too horrific to understand. In 1922, the world was buzzing with excitement, the scent of discovery hanging thick in the air. The ancient tomb of King Tutankhamun had just been uncovered in Egypt, and with it, an endless flow of treasures that stunned the world. But amid the glinting gold and glittering jewels, something darker, something far more sinister, was lurking. Within weeks of the tomb's opening, the first of the cursed deaths began. Lord Carnarvon, the British aristocrat who financed the excavation, was the first to fall victim. He was in England when a strange fever overtook him. His health rapidly deteriorated, his skin turning pale and his breath shallow. The doctors could offer no explanation. By the time he passed away, rumors had already begun to swirl. Was it a coincidence, or had the curse of the Pharaohs claimed its first victim? Some said he had opened the tomb and disturbed the spirit of the boy king, who had long been resting in peace. Others whispered that his death was merely the beginning, that the curse would claim all those who dared to disturb the ancient tombs of Egypt. Lord Carnarvon's death was followed by an inexplicable string of tragedies. His dog, a terrier named Susie, had been with him in the days before his sudden illness. The dog had been healthy, but upon hearing of its owner's death, it too perished, collapsing suddenly as if struck by an invisible hand. It was said that the dog had howled at the night air just hours before its death, as though sensing something dark and unexplainable. But the most chilling part? The deaths didn't stop with Lord Carnarvon. Within a year, several of the other men involved in the tomb's discovery met untimely ends. Sir Bruce Ingram, a close friend of Lord Carnarvon, had his house destroyed in a fire just months after Carnarvon's death. The flames consumed everything. Then there was George Gould, an American who had been part of the excavation team. He died of a fever shortly after the discovery, his body found cold and lifeless, as though the life had been drained from him. Some said it was a coincidence. Others argued that it wasn't. As the death toll continued to rise, people began to believe that something more was at play, something beyond human understanding. Could it really be that a curse, centuries old, had been unleashed on these men for disturbing the peace of the long-dead king? Then came the story of the American millionaire, James R. Sheffield. He was a collector of Egyptian artifacts, and just a year after the tomb's opening, he purchased a relic that had been unearthed from the same tomb. It was a small, innocent-looking statuette, nothing more than a decorative piece of stone, but that little object would seal his fate. Within days of bringing the statue into his home, Sheffield fell ill. Doctors were baffled. His body wasted away, and in the final moments of his life, he was said to have muttered the same words over and over again, "The curse, it's real," as if his body were consumed by the very forces that had been awakened in that tomb. Even as more and more people succumbed to mysterious and tragic fates, one name kept popping up over and over again: Howard Carter, the man responsible for the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb. He was the one who had broken the seal and uncovered the ancient king's final resting place. And yet, despite the countless deaths surrounding him, Howard Carter lived on. He grew older, living a relatively quiet life after his monumental discovery. Many couldn't understand it. Why had he survived? Was he immune to the curse? Or had the ancient gods simply chosen to spare him? But Howard Carter's survival was no comfort to those who believed in the curse. As the years went by, they spoke of divine retribution, and the deaths seemed too many to ignore. The story of the curse echoed throughout Egypt and beyond, spreading to all who dared tamper with the ancient secrets of the land. Was it a warning? A message from a time long past? Or had the curse simply been a string of coincidences too dark and twisted to explain? In the years that followed, the story of King Tut's curse became a legend. One by one, people who had come into contact with the tomb or its artifacts were struck down by strange, unexplainable fates. Some were never found, their bodies disappearing into the desert sands. Others were found in horrific conditions, eyes wide open, frozen in expressions of terror. But the most heart-wrenching of these deaths was that of an archaeologist named Richard Bethel, a close associate of Howard Carter. Bethel had been there from the beginning, overseeing the removal of treasures from the tomb. He was a man of sharp wit, a seasoned archaeologist who had seen countless tombs. Yet it was his own life that was claimed in the most gruesome of ways. One night, Bethel was found in his London home. He had been strangled with his own bedsheets, his face twisted in horror, as if in his final moments, he had seen something that could never be explained. Some claimed that it was the curse at work, that Bethel had unwittingly sealed his fate by disturbing the sacred tomb of the Pharaohs. Others believed it was a tragic accident, but as time went on, the whispers grew louder, and the line between coincidence and divine retribution blurred. As more people connected to the tomb passed away in strange, violent ways, the story of the curse seemed to reach beyond the borders of Egypt. It spread through the hearts of those who listened, weaving its way into the stories told late at night, when the air was thick with mystery and fear. Each death, each tragedy, seemed to lend credence to the idea that some forces were beyond human understanding. No one could say for sure whether these deaths were simply coincidences or if something far darker was at work. The evidence seemed too overwhelming to ignore. Whether it was divine retribution, the anger of a forgotten king, or some other unseen force, the deaths continued, leaving behind only shattered lives and unanswered questions. The mystery would remain, a haunting specter hanging in the air, as real and present as the shadows that stretched across the walls of those ancient tombs. And for those who dared to ask the question, the curse would always be there, waiting, watching, and reminding them that some secrets were never meant to be uncovered. The room was silent, the air thick with unease. Every eye was on the door as the clock ticked on, but no one moved. The legend had been told once again, this time to a new generation. A curse, whispered in hushed tones, wrapped itself around their thoughts, taking root in the deepest corners of their minds. No one was willing to break the silence first. No one would be the first to act. They all felt it, the grip of fear, subtle yet unyielding. There are some things in this world that seem so impossible, so incomprehensible, that the mere idea of them can shatter a person's sense of control. Curses are one of them. Even when a person knows there is no real power behind them, the fear they inspire is very real. And that fear, it shapes decisions, twisting lives in ways that can be seen in every corner of history. The simple belief in a curse can change a life forever, often in ways far more damaging than any actual event could. When a curse is spoken, the mind becomes a battlefield. It is as if the curse itself takes root within the person's thoughts, their actions no longer their own, but dictated by the belief that something terrible is destined to happen. It begins with a seed of doubt, then grows into a fear so large, it clouds everything, every step, every choice, every whisper of the wind. It affects not just the one who believes, but everyone around them. And soon, like a spreading disease, it spreads beyond the individual, infecting entire families, communities, even entire societies. Take the case of an archaeologist who, while studying ancient Egyptian artifacts, uncovered an object many believed to be cursed. He was skeptical, of course. But the moment he heard the warning, his steps faltered. He laughed it off, yet the unease gnawed at him. The night after his discovery, he found himself staring at the relic, an uneasiness twisting in his stomach. Sleep eluded him. His mind raced with the ancient tales of the Pharaoh's wrath. By the time he awoke, his heart was racing, his palms sweating. The relic was untouched, but his world had shifted. He told no one, but it was clear that something had changed. His decisions grew erratic. Every small misstep felt like a sure sign of the curse coming to claim him. He canceled meetings, avoided friends, and became increasingly paranoid. Nothing tangible had occurred. No mysterious illness, no sudden accidents. Yet his behavior grew more unpredictable. He began to make choices driven by fear. The power of the curse had begun to twist his perception of reality. The fear of curses has a way of seeping into the deepest recesses of the mind, where logic and reason are no longer able to provide solace. It was the same with the old man in the village, who'd heard rumors of a curse linked to a forbidden tree in the forest. No one had ever seen anyone directly harmed by it, but the fear, so deeply ingrained in the community's history, was enough to drive him to madness. He couldn't help but feel that the tree was watching him, its gnarled roots extending deeper into his soul with every passing moment. He began to avoid the forest, even taking long detours to avoid seeing the tree. He feared it, not because of any physical threat, but because he couldn't escape the psychological torment it induced. In his fear, the old man made a choice to change his life. He left his home and traveled far away. He took precautions, carrying items thought to ward off evil spirits, avoiding certain streets, even refusing to visit family for fear the curse might follow him. The deeper the belief in curses, the greater the distance people will go to avoid their perceived doom. Sometimes, the fear of curses is not just personal but collective. A family hears that a particular heirloom has been passed down through generations, always bringing misfortune. The curse isn't attached to the object itself, but to the idea that it brings misfortune. Each member of the family, knowing the history, begins to interpret every bad event as a sign of the curse's power. The fear takes root in every conversation. Did you hear? Another accident. I told you it was the curse. They no longer look for rational explanations. The family becomes trapped in a web of beliefs. And every misfortune, no matter how small, is proof that the curse is real. One particularly haunting case is that of a woman who inherited a necklace from her grandmother. It had been passed down for generations, and for generations, it had been linked to a string of tragic deaths. The woman was told the stories from an early age, how each woman who had worn the necklace had fallen victim to a terrible fate. Though she didn't believe in the curse herself, she couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong. She felt uneasy every time she touched the necklace. She was hesitant to wear it, even though it was a beautiful heirloom that she had every right to cherish. It started subtly. She began to experience bouts of unexplained anxiety. Her heart would race for no apparent reason. The necklace would always be on her mind, no matter how hard she tried to distract herself. Her life seemed to go from bad to worse. Financial troubles, health issues, and relationship problems began to pile up, one after the other. And the more she thought about it, the more she felt the curse looming over her, tainting everything she touched. In the end, she made a choice that would change everything. She locked the necklace away, convinced that she had to sever her connection to the past. But even as she locked it away, the belief in the curse never left her. The fear still had its claws in her heart. And though she might have physically removed the object, the curse, in her mind, still held sway over her life. It is this fear, the belief in something invisible, something that cannot be seen or touched, that has the most profound effect. The psychological impact of curses is so much more than superstition. It's a way in which the mind begins to shape reality itself. It is the power of belief, unseen and unexplainable, that controls the actions, the choices, and the very lives of those who dare to believe. Perhaps the most tragic part of it all is how this fear warps the human experience. The lives of those who fall prey to these beliefs are not marked by the curses they fear, but by the self-imposed prison they create. Their behaviors, their decisions, are shaped by an invisible force, one that feeds on their own doubts, fears, and insecurities. And in the end, it's not the curse itself that causes harm, but the belief in it. The belief that something is out there, waiting for them to fail. It's the moment when something shifts in the air, so slight that you can barely notice it. A faint dizziness washes over you, followed by a headache that seems to come from nowhere. Your vision blurs, and a strange, almost oppressive feeling settles on your chest. It's as if the world around you is suddenly different, heavier, colder. You shake it off, but deep down, you know something is wrong. Then, weeks later, strange things start to happen. People around you begin to act strangely, suddenly paranoid, their minds clouded with thoughts they can't control. Unseen forces seem to affect everyone, and no matter how much you try to deny it, you can't shake the feeling that something far beyond your control is at work. What if, instead of an ancient curse, something else was responsible? Something invisible, silent, and insidious that you can't see or touch, but feels very real. Could it be that the poison creeping through the air, the hidden dangers lurking in the walls, or the very ground beneath you holds a truth far darker than superstition? What if the curses that have terrified generations are not magical forces, but the result of something as mundane as bacteria, toxic molds, or even the environment itself? In a house that had stood for centuries, the whispers of an ancient curse grew louder with each passing year. Family after family moved in, only to leave within months, citing unexplained illness, sudden deaths, or overwhelming feelings of dread. It became the stuff of local legend, the house everyone avoided. The curse, they said, would strike anyone who dared to live there, claiming their lives, their sanity. People moved, but the story never changed. But what if it wasn't the curse that was responsible? What if the mold creeping through the walls, the greenish-black stains that seemed to grow no matter how many times the house was cleaned, held the key? Researchers have long known that certain types of mold release spores into the air that, when inhaled, can cause confusion, memory loss, and anxiety. These invisible invaders could easily explain the strange behavior of the families who lived there. As their mental health deteriorated, they couldn't help but wonder if the legends had been right all along. There's something about mold, something sinister that can thrive in the dark, damp corners of an old building, far from human eyes. It feeds on decay and rot, multiplying silently, growing in places no one dares to look. And it has the power to reach deep inside your mind, to cloud your thoughts, to twist your perceptions. As people were exposed to it, the symptoms would appear one by one: headaches, nausea, memory loss, each symptom written off as just another strange coincidence, until the story took on a life of its own. The house didn't just claim lives, it claimed sanity, and with it, a piece of the truth. Even stranger, the weathered tombs of ancient Egypt, some of the world's most famous and most feared, have stories tied to them that echo the same symptoms. Historians have linked the curse of the Pharaohs to an outbreak of illness that swept through the team that uncovered King Tutankhamun's tomb. But as time passed and more information came to light, scientists began to consider the possibility that the strange symptoms might not have been supernatural at all. Many of those who explored these tombs were exposed to toxic molds and bacteria that grew in the damp, sealed tombs. The close quarters, the lack of ventilation, and the decaying materials of the tombs created the perfect environment for these microscopic threats to thrive. Toxic bacteria, too, have the potential to wreak havoc in ways that are far more horrifying than any curse. Take the case of a group of explorers who ventured into the forests of South America. They uncovered an ancient burial site that had been hidden for centuries, a place untouched by modern hands. But what they didn't know was that the soil beneath their feet was teeming with spores of a rare and deadly fungus. The explorers began to show signs of illness, fevers, headaches, vomiting, but they brushed it off as exhaustion from their travels. However, as days passed, the symptoms worsened. One by one, they fell ill, their minds slowly descending into madness. The symptoms mirrored what could be described as the wrath of an ancient curse, but the real cause was far more terrifying. The fungus had infiltrated their systems, altering their thoughts, ravaging their bodies. Some, with their weakened immune systems, were unable to fight off the invisible enemy. Others fell victim to hallucinations, their perceptions warped as they struggled to make sense of what was happening to them. They began to blame the curse of the site, convinced that the spirits of the ancient dead were punishing them. But the truth was something darker. The environment itself had conspired against them, a silent killer that neither they nor their ancestors had been prepared for. The curse they feared was nothing more than the biological effects of a place forgotten by time. It's unsettling, the way something as invisible as bacteria or mold can turn a perfectly normal experience into something supernatural. And it's not just explorers or archaeologists who are affected. People living in areas plagued by environmental dangers often report the same strange experiences: unexplained illnesses, sudden tragedies, a sense of impending doom. In some cases, they're living in buildings contaminated by unseen forces, mold, toxins, bacteria, waiting, silently, for them to succumb. It's the mental toll that's the most insidious. Once the fear sets in, once the belief in something unnatural takes root, nothing seems safe anymore. People can't help but wonder, what's out there? What's waiting to reach in and pull them under? They begin to mistrust their own senses, unable to separate what is real from what they fear might be. Even today, there are stories told in hushed voices about cursed lands, haunted homes, and forbidden places where the strange and unexplainable occur. But with each passing year, more and more, scientists are uncovering the truths behind the legends. It's not ghosts that linger, but mold growing in the corners of forgotten rooms. It's not curses that haunt the tombs, but bacteria waiting for the right conditions to make their move. In a world where superstition still runs deep, it's hard to shake the feeling that perhaps these ancient stories, these modern-day horrors, are just a glimpse into a truth we aren't ready to face. That the curses we fear, the things that terrorize our dreams, may be nothing more than the earth itself fighting back, in ways we can barely comprehend. And as we dig deeper into both the past and the present, we're left to wonder, are we really being punished, or is it simply the cost of living in a world so full of hidden dangers? The line between reality and the supernatural grows ever thinner, and the question remains, what's really causing our nightmares? The air was thick with heat and dust, the oppressive silence broken only by the soft shuffle of feet in the sand. Beneath the weight of centuries, the tomb lay hidden, waiting to reveal its secrets. It was the kind of discovery that made hearts race, an ancient burial chamber untouched by time. And yet, as the first crack of the stone tomb was made, an unmistakable chill seemed to wash over the excavators. They paused, exchanging nervous glances, as the words that had haunted them for weeks echoed in their minds, the curse of the Pharaohs. At first, it seemed like superstition, just the whispers of old stories passed down through generations. But then, tragedy struck. A series of inexplicable deaths, illnesses, and misfortunes followed, each one tied to the opening of this tomb. The archaeologists, driven by curiosity and the thrill of discovery, couldn't help but wonder, was it the curse? Or was something more scientific at play? The debate over whether curses truly exist has been ongoing for centuries. Egyptologists, scholars who have dedicated their lives to studying ancient Egyptian history and culture, have long been skeptical about the supernatural explanations. They argue that the so-called curses surrounding tombs like that of King Tutankhamun's are nothing more than the stuff of legend, fueled by coincidence, misfortune, and the power of suggestion. But the stories continue to haunt those who dare to question them. Skepticism in Egyptology has never been stronger. For decades, the so-called curse of the Pharaohs has been dissected and analyzed. Some scholars claim that the curse is a psychological phenomenon, a fear born out of the unknown. After all, these tombs, some of which had been untouched for thousands of years, were filled with toxins, mold, and bacteria, agents that could cause illness. Others argue that the curse is a product of history itself, a tool used to keep tombs undisturbed by thieves and robbers. But how does one explain the inexplicable? The deaths of those closely involved in the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb? The strange accidents that plagued them in the aftermath? Was it simply bad luck, or something deeper at play? The greatest minds in Egyptology have long tried to find the scientific explanation behind the curse, trying to offer up rational theories to explain the series of events that followed the discovery of tombs. They argue that the curse is nothing more than a psychological reaction, a form of mass hysteria. In the age of modern science, they contend, there is no place for curses and supernatural forces. Diseases, bacteria, and toxins are far more likely culprits than spirits of the dead seeking revenge. But no matter how much science tries to explain it away, there's still an unsettling feeling that lingers. Can science truly erase centuries of belief, of fear, of the deeply rooted tradition that curses are more than mere stories? Can the ancient Egyptians really have created some sort of supernatural force to protect their tombs, or is it all just a tragic combination of coincidence and superstition? As the debate rages on, those who stand firm in the world of Egyptology try to push aside the allure of the supernatural. For them, the stories of curses are just that, stories, passed down through generations, influenced by the human need to understand the unknown. These scholars believe in facts and evidence. They reject the idea that ancient Egyptians could have wielded some magical power that lingers even today. Yet, for all their skepticism, the stories are hard to ignore. Take, for example, the case of Lord Carnarvon, the British aristocrat who funded the expedition to King Tut's tomb. He died suddenly from an infection, mere months after the tomb was opened. His death was followed by a series of unfortunate events, leading many to believe that the curse had claimed yet another victim. Even those who tried to rationalize the situation couldn't help but feel the weight of the tragedy. Was it coincidence? Or was there something more at play, something beyond our understanding? Many Egyptologists have been quick to argue that the sudden deaths and misfortunes surrounding tomb openings are just a result of the dangers inherent in working with ancient artifacts. The truth is, tombs like Tutankhamun's were sealed for millennia, and the air inside was thick with dangerous toxins. As these tombs were opened and explored, the bacteria, mold, and other harmful agents trapped within could easily cause illness, and in some cases, death. But there is something undeniably eerie about the timing of these events, something that feels far beyond a scientific explanation. The presence of death and misfortune in the wake of these discoveries leaves an unsettling feeling. For every scientific theory, there are countless stories of archaeologists who couldn't explain the sense of dread that crept up on them as they unearthed ancient treasures. How do you explain the sudden urge to stop, the shivers that race down your spine, the feeling of being watched? These are not things that can be easily explained away with the cold precision of science. And then, there are the stories that don't fit the mold of rational explanation. The unexplained disappearances of archaeologists and explorers who ventured too deep into tombs, only to be found days or weeks later, their bodies ravaged by strange illness, their faces frozen in terror. How do we explain that? It is in these moments, the ones that defy logic and reason, that the skepticism of Egyptologists begins to falter. For all the evidence they can present, for all the scientific data they can gather, there remains a small, nagging question: what if there's more to the story? What if, after centuries of burying their dead with elaborate rituals and protective curses, the ancient Egyptians truly believed in the power of these curses? And if they believed, could there be some truth to their belief? Skeptics continue to argue that the curse of the Pharaohs is simply an illusion, a tragic series of events disguised as something more sinister. But no matter how hard they try to convince the world, there's still something deeply unsettling about the curse that refuses to be erased. Every time a new tomb is unearthed, every time an archaeologist falls ill or suffers an accident, the question lingers in the air: is it just a coincidence of bad luck, or is there something deeper at work? Something that science can't explain away. The old woman's fingers trembled as she tied the final knot around the small, polished stone. Her breath was shallow, her movements deliberate, as though she carried the weight of something far greater than herself. It wasn't just a charm, it was her last defense, a shield between her and the darkness that had been creeping closer each night. The stories had been whispered across generations. Curses could linger like shadows, clinging to families, homes, or even objects. But for every curse, there was a counter, a small talisman imbued with hope and belief. Amulets were never just decorations. They were anchors in a sea of fear, a way to reclaim control when the unknown became too overwhelming. For centuries, people have turned to these tiny objects, often carved, inscribed, or fashioned with meticulous care. An amulet could be a pendant worn around the neck, a ring on a trembling finger, or even a small token tucked beneath a pillow. What gave them their power wasn't just the materials they were made from, but the conviction behind them. They weren't merely objects, they were shields of faith against unseen forces. There is something haunting about the moment someone feels the need for such a charm. It isn't casual or lighthearted. It's born from desperation, from the weight of something inexplicable that presses down on the soul. A man in a small village, his crops failing year after year, might clutch a carved figure of a deity, begging for the curse on his land to lift. A mother who has lost too many children to sickness might knot a piece of red thread around her remaining baby's wrist, whispering prayers into the night. And then there are the stories of those who dared to challenge curses directly. Amulets weren't just passive objects, they were tools of defiance. In ancient Egypt, priests and healers would create scarabs engraved with protective symbols, their intricate designs meant to repel malevolent spirits. The wearer would hold the charm close, trusting that its energy would protect them from harm. It wasn't just belief, it was survival. But not all amulets were made with hope. Some carried the weight of vengeance. There were those who believed that the same objects used to repel curses could also send them back. Talismans were inscribed with words that burned like fire in the ears of the cursed, symbols that twisted the darkness onto itself. In the wrong hands, these protective charms could become weapons, tools of retaliation as sharp as any blade. For the people who lived under the shadow of curses, the act of creating or wearing an amulet was a moment of profound emotion. It wasn't just about the object itself, but the ritual surrounding it. A woman lighting candles as she whispered her fears into the night, binding them into a charm. A father carving a symbol into a piece of wood, his hand steady despite the tears streaming down his face. The amulet was more than protection, it was hope given form. In many cultures, the materials used to create these charms held as much significance as the symbols they bore. Silver, thought to repel evil, was shaped into small tokens to be carried in pockets. Stones, especially those thought to hold mystical properties, were polished smooth and worn close to the skin. Even the simple act of tying a knot became a form of magic, binding the wearer to safety and pushing away the darkness. Yet, not all who turned to amulets found peace. There were stories of charms that seemed to fail, their power overwhelmed by forces too strong to contain. A young boy who clung to a necklace his grandmother had blessed, only to fall ill with the very sickness she feared. A merchant who wore a ring etched with protective symbols, yet lost everything to a fire that consumed his home. When the amulet failed, the sense of loss was deeper than words. It was a betrayal, a shattering of the fragile hope it had represented. But for every story of failure, there were whispers of miraculous triumphs. A fisherman lost at sea for days, his only possession a small carved charm he swore kept him alive. A family cursed for generations, finally finding peace after burying a talisman at the foot of an ancient tree. These stories, passed down through time, kept the belief alive. The power of amulets wasn't just in the object or its creation. It was in the belief of the person who carried it. In their hands, a simple stone could become an unbreakable shield, a thread tied around a wrist could hold back the weight of despair. The connection between the object and its wearer was as sacred as any prayer, as binding as any vow. In the quiet moments of fear, when the weight of a curse felt unbearable, amulets became lifelines. They were clutched in trembling hands, pressed against beating hearts, whispered to in the dead of night. They were more than objects. They were a promise, a reminder that even in the face of the unexplainable, there was something to hold on to. And perhaps that is where their true power lies. Not in the materials they are made from or the rituals that surround them, but in the hope they carry. In the belief that, no matter how dark the night, there is always a light waiting to be found. The air inside the old theater was thick with anticipation. The projector hummed to life, casting flickering shadows across the room. On the screen, an archaeologist in a dusty hat approached a sealed tomb, his torchlight dancing on ancient hieroglyphs. The audience leaned forward in their seats, hearts pounding as the explorer's trembling hands brushed against the stone. A whispered warning, barely audible, hinted at danger. And then, the curse was unleashed. For over a century, the allure of Egyptian curses has haunted popular culture like a specter, captivating minds and stirring imaginations. These stories, painted with intrigue and terror, have made their way into books, films, and television, creating an enduring mythology that feels as old as the pyramids themselves. In 1922, when Howard Carter unearthed the tomb of Tutankhamun, the discovery became more than a moment in history, it became the seed for a legend. The supposed curse etched into the annals of modern lore claimed lives, striking down those who dared to disturb the boy king's eternal rest. News of sudden death spread like wildfire, and the line between coincidence and curse blurred. The world, enchanted and horrified, latched onto the tale, and it quickly became the foundation for a narrative that would endure through generations. Hollywood seized the myth with both hands. Blockbuster films like The Mummy transformed the curse into an ominous force, a tangible evil that stalked its victims relentlessly. The cursed tomb became a stage for terrifying spectacles, collapsing ceilings, swarms of insects, and ghostly apparitions that left audiences clutching their seats in terror. The stories may have been fictional, but they were rooted in something primal, a fear of the unknown, the unseen forces that might punish those who trespass. Even as films brought the curse to life with cinematic flair, literature wove its own threads into the tapestry. Gothic novels penned haunting tales of cursed relics and doomed expeditions. The elegant horror of cursed Egyptian treasures seduced readers, inviting them into worlds where the price of curiosity was death. These stories didn't just entertain, they tapped into a deeper, darker place in the human psyche. They whispered that some secrets were never meant to be uncovered, some doors never meant to be opened. Television added its own layers to the myth. Documentaries dramatized the dangers of exploring ancient tombs, combining eerie reenactments with ominous voiceovers. Fictional series brought cursed mummies into modern cities, blending ancient fear with contemporary settings. The curse of the Pharaohs, once confined to the sands of Egypt, now haunted every corner of the globe. It became not just a tale of the past, but a specter that could reach across time. Pop culture didn't merely repeat the myth, it reshaped it, amplifying its power. The curse became more than a warning, it became a character, an unseen villain lurking in the shadows. It wasn't just the archaeologist in peril, it was anyone who dared to handle an artifact or speak the forbidden words. The curse, intangible and invisible, became omnipotent. There's a peculiar magic in how these stories endure. Each new interpretation breathes fresh life into the myth, ensuring its survival. From animated adventures where mummies come to life to spine-chilling horror films that leave viewers afraid to sleep, the curse adapts, evolving with each retelling. It's a story that refuses to die, much like the restless spirits it describes. For many, the curse isn't just entertainment, it feels personal. Viewers and readers find themselves questioning their own boundaries. Would they dare step into a cursed tomb? Could they resist the pull of ancient treasure? The stories invite us to confront our own fears, our own curiosity, and the consequences of crossing forbidden lines. The enduring appeal of the curse isn't just about fear, it's about awe. The grandeur of Egypt's ancient civilization, the mystery of its hieroglyphs and artifacts, casts a spell over anyone who dares to look. The curse becomes a bridge between the past and the present, a reminder of the power and mystique of a world long gone. Modern media has ensured that this legend will never fade. Every retelling, every reinterpretation, adds new layers to the tale. Whether it's a chilling thriller, a dramatic documentary, or a fantastical adventure, the curse of the Pharaohs continues to hold us in its grip, its whispered warnings echoing across time. And as long as there are stories to tell, the curse will remain, haunting the edges of our imagination, waiting to strike. The desert wind whispered through the ancient stones, carrying a voice only the brave could hear. The great pyramids of Giza loomed under the blazing sun, their sharp lines and monumental presence defying time itself. Among the throngs of tourists stood a woman clutching her camera tightly, her eyes darting to the tour guide who spun tales of glory, betrayal, and unrelenting curses. She had come seeking wonder, but now her heart thudded with an uneasy rhythm. "Do not disturb the past," the guide said with a mischievous smile, his words hanging in the air like an unseen hand. Many who ignored this warning faced misfortune they could not escape. The crowd exchanged nervous glances. Laughter broke the tension, but it was brittle, the kind that masked fear. Someone snapped a photo, and the sound of the shutter felt louder than it should have, as though it might wake something buried deep beneath the sand. Curses. The word lingered on everyone's tongue, unspoken but present. It wasn't just a story, it was a feeling, a hum in the bones, a chill that defied the sun's heat. Visitors might tell themselves it was all a myth, yet their steps grew cautious as they approached the tombs. Cameras were lifted hesitantly, as if a simple flash might summon the wrath of ancient gods. In the Valley of the Kings, shadows stretched long and heavy, casting dark veins across the stone walls. A father held his daughter's hand tightly as she stared at the hieroglyphs with wide, curious eyes. "Will they be angry with us?" she whispered. He shook his head with a comforting smile, but his grip tightened. It was hard to ignore the stories, how explorers, treasure hunters, and scholars had met mysterious ends after entering these sacred places. The girl shivered, her excitement now tinged with a touch of fear. Local guides often amplify these tales, their voices rich with drama. They point to faded warnings carved in ancient scripts and speak of winds that howl louder near certain tombs. Some add their own twists, recounting stories of visitors who grew ill or lost their belongings after failing to show respect. Coincidence, they ask, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of the unknown. The crowd listens, spellbound, unsure whether to laugh or gasp. At night, the streets of Cairo come alive with the flicker of lanterns and the aroma of spiced tea. Tourists gather in hotel lobbies, swapping stories of their day. Some claim to have heard whispers in the tombs, a low murmur just beyond the reach of understanding. Others speak of a peculiar heaviness, an unseen force pressing on their chest as they wandered the corridors of ancient crypts. A young couple recalls how their camera malfunctioned just as they tried to capture a particular carving, a stern face that seemed to glare back at them. "It's just the equipment," the husband says, but his voice lacks conviction. Vendors near the pyramids often sell small amulets and charms, their vibrant colors glinting under the sunlight. Some tourists purchase them as souvenirs, while others clutch them like talismans, convinced they might ward off whatever unseen force might follow them home. Blessed for protection, the sellers assure them, and the buyers nod, holding the tokens with reverent care. Even skeptics find themselves drawn to the idea, their logic faltering against the weight of ancient myths. One visitor, a writer, spoke of how she felt watched the entire time she explored a tomb. She wrote in her journal that the air inside was thick, almost alive, as though it carried the breath of the pharaohs. Her pen trembled as she documented the experience, her usually steady hand betraying a lingering unease. Later, she refused to sleep without her newly acquired scarab amulet beside her bed, a silent prayer against the unknown. For the local communities, these stories are a lifeline as much as they are a legacy. They understand the power of a well-told tale and how it draws visitors from every corner of the globe. The shopkeeper who sells papyrus paintings whispers to customers about the legend of a cursed necklace, adding a personal anecdote about a distant cousin who met misfortune after touching it. The hotel receptionist shares a hushed warning about respecting the tombs, her tone so earnest that even seasoned travelers pause to consider her words. Yet, beneath the allure of the curse, there is a quieter, more personal transformation taking place. Many visitors leave with more than just souvenirs, they carry a sense of awe, of having touched something vast and untouchable. Some admit to feeling humbled, their lives reframed by the weight of history and the whispers of the past. The curse, whether believed or dismissed, becomes a part of their experience, a thread in the tapestry of memories they carry home. The woman with the camera finally stepped into the tomb she had dreamed of seeing for years. The air was cooler inside, the silence deep and profound. Her footsteps echoed softly as she moved forward, her pulse quickening with each step. She reached the inner chamber, where the pharaoh's sarcophagus rested, its surface carved with intricate symbols. She hesitated before raising her camera, a sudden thought halting her movement. Was she trespassing where she didn't belong? Would she, too, carry something unseen back into the world? Her hands trembled as she clicked the shutter. The flash illuminated the room for a brief moment, and she felt a rush of cold air, as though something ancient had exhaled. Her heart raced, and she quickly lowered the camera, whispering an apology under her breath. She would later laugh about the moment over dinner, but the chill she felt in that tomb would never quite leave her. The myth of the curse doesn't just live in books or films, it lingers in the hearts of those who visit these timeless places. It's there in the hesitant steps, the hurried whispers, and the way people glance over their shoulders as they leave. For some, it's a thrill, for others, a warning, but for all, it's unforgettable. Ancient Egypt, with its sprawling deserts and towering monuments, holds more than just the stories of the past. It holds the power to make people feel alive, on the edge of wonder and fear, in a way few places ever can. The clay tablet lay cracked and ancient, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to pulse with an invisible force. It was no larger than a man's hand, yet it carried a weight far beyond its size. The words inscribed on it were not just records or prayers, they were warnings. Whispers of a time when curses were woven into the fabric of belief, binding the heavens and the earth with unseen threads. In Mesopotamia, under the vast expanse of starlit skies and among the towering ziggurats, curses held a power that felt as real as the rivers that gave life to the land. They were not just threats but tools, crafted with precision, spoken with intent, and written with an unshakable certainty that the gods themselves would heed their call. To cross the boundaries set by these ancient words was to invite divine judgment, swift and unrelenting. The scribes who inscribed these curses were meticulous, their hands steady as they pressed sharp styluses into the soft clay. Each stroke was deliberate, each symbol a portal through which their fury or fear could travel. These were not idle threats, they were contracts, binding and eternal. To tamper with a tomb, steal from a temple, or violate sacred laws was to invoke the wrath of beings far beyond mortal comprehension. In the dim light of flickering torches, a priest might recite the curse aloud, his voice resonating through the temple halls. His words carried the weight of the gods, trembling with the promise of plague, famine, or madness for those who dared to disobey. A shiver would pass through those who listened, their faces pale as they imagined the unseen horrors waiting to be unleashed. Centuries later, the desert winds would carry echoes of these curses, mingling them with whispers of Egyptian tombs and their warnings. It is here that the parallel becomes undeniable. In Egypt, the curse was a guardian of the dead, a shield for the sanctity of the afterlife. In Mesopotamia, it was a weapon of the living, a blade forged from anger, fear, or betrayal. One can almost hear the chants that must have risen in Mesopotamian cities, their cadence matching the rhythm of a beating heart. May Enlil strike you down, the curse might begin, invoking the chief of the gods. May the waters of the Tigris turn against you, and may the wind scatter your name like dust. Each phrase was a dagger, sharp and precise, aimed at the soul of its target. The power of these words was not confined to the realm of punishment. They reflected the hopes and fears of a people who saw the divine in every shadow, every star, and every drop of rain. A curse was as much a plea as it was a threat, a cry for justice in a world where the balance between order and chaos was fragile. It was an acknowledgement of human frailty, a way to bridge the gap between the mortal and the divine. And yet, there was a strange beauty in these curses, a poetry that lingered in the air like incense. In Egypt, the warnings were often etched in hieroglyphs, their elegance masking the terror beneath. In Mesopotamia, they were raw and visceral, carved into clay that baked under the sun, eternal and unyielding. The contrast between the two is striking. Egyptian curses spoke of eternal unrest and wandering spirits, while Mesopotamian imprecations called forth tangible, earthly punishments. A tale is told of a Mesopotamian king who cursed those who would destroy his legacy. May the god of storms darken their days, may their children's laughter turn to wails, and may the ground refuse to bear their steps, he declared. His enemies dared not touch his city for decades, the weight of his words holding them at bay. It is said that when his palace finally fell, the curse claimed those responsible with swift vengeance, an earthquake swallowing their victory whole. These stories do not exist in isolation. They linger in the imagination, weaving themselves into the fabric of human fear and wonder. The curse, whether from Mesopotamia or Egypt, transcends time and space, speaking to something primal within us all. It is the voice that warns us to tread carefully, to respect the boundaries set by forces we cannot see. Standing before the ruins of an ancient Mesopotamian temple, one can almost feel the presence of those who once believed so fiercely in the power of their words. The clay tablets may crumble, the carvings may fade, but the energy of those curses remains, a whisper carried on the wind, a reminder that the past is never truly gone. The comparison is not just about differences, it is about the shared humanity that breathes life into these ancient traditions. Whether it is the Pharaoh's stern warning or the Mesopotamian priest's impassioned plea, the heart of the curse is the same. It is a voice crying out against injustice, a barrier against the encroaching chaos of the unknown. And yet, despite the similarities, there is an undeniable tension in the air when these two traditions are remembered side by side. The sands of Egypt hold their secrets tightly, while the clay of Mesopotamia crumbles to reveal its truths. The curse, in all its forms, serves as a bridge between the mortal and the divine, a thread connecting the ancient and the eternal. It is a reminder that words, once spoken or inscribed, can shape the very fabric of existence. The flames of a flickering torch danced against cold stone walls as a Roman scholar stood in a dimly lit library, his hands trembling over a scroll of Egyptian origin. His eyes darted across symbols etched with precision, and an unease settled in the room. The whispers of ancient curses seemed to seep from the parchment, filling the air with a tension that pressed against his chest. He could almost hear a distant, mournful voice murmuring warnings meant for another time, another place. For the Greeks and Romans, Egypt was a land of mysteries, a world where gods walked among mortals, and the boundary between life and death blurred. The curses they encountered weren't just words, they were shadows of a power they couldn't fully understand. To them, Egypt wasn't merely a civilization, it was a living, breathing enigma, its secrets coiled like a serpent waiting to strike. Greek philosophers, eager to decipher the unknown, approached Egyptian curses with equal parts fascination and dread. They admired the precision of the hieroglyphs, the way they seemed to hold a story within a story, layered with meaning. But beneath the admiration was a gnawing fear. These weren't empty threats, they carried a conviction that the gods themselves had sanctioned these warnings. To violate a tomb, to ignore the engraved admonitions, was to invite not just misfortune but divine retribution. The Romans, ever pragmatic, took a different approach. They saw in Egyptian curses an echo of their own beliefs, a reflection of the sacred vows and invocations that bound their society together. But there was something darker in the Egyptian words, something that went beyond the mortal realm. A Roman general, upon hearing of a tomb inscribed with a curse promising eternal unrest to violators, ordered his soldiers to retreat. "Better to face an enemy in battle than a wrath that follows you even in death," he is said to have muttered. In time, the influence of these curses seeped into the fabric of Greek and Roman culture. The Greeks, with their love for drama, wove tales of Egyptian curses into their tragedies. The characters in their stories often faced the wrath of gods for daring to challenge fate, much like the cursed souls warned by Egyptian inscriptions. A Greek playwright might describe the curse of a pharaoh as a fate worse than death, an eternal wandering, stripped of peace and light. The Romans, with their penchant for law and order, adapted Egyptian curses into their own rituals. They created depictions, thin sheets of lead inscribed with curses meant to bind enemies or exact vengeance. These were slipped into graves or hidden in sacred spaces, their words carrying the same chilling resolve as the warnings etched on Egyptian tombs. "May your sleep turn to torment," one such defixio read, echoing the eternal unrest promised by the Pharaohs' inscriptions. But beyond the fear and adaptation was a profound respect. Greek scholars marveled at the Egyptians' understanding of the afterlife, their belief in a journey that extended beyond the physical world. They saw the curses not as mere threats, but as guardians, protectors of a sacred path. This reverence bled into their own philosophies, shaping ideas about mortality and the divine. Roman emperors, too, were drawn to the allure of Egyptian rituals. They imported obelisks and statues, incorporating them into their cities as symbols of power and mystery. Yet, with these monuments came the weight of the curses that once protected them. Roman priests would perform elaborate ceremonies to cleanse these artifacts, hoping to appease any lingering spirits. And still, there were whispers, rumors of misfortunes befalling those who dared to tamper with the sacred objects of Egypt. The stories didn't stop there. Greek and Roman poets, captivated by the mystique of Egyptian curses, wove them into their epics. They spoke of heroes who faced not only physical trials, but the wrath of unseen forces, curses that clung to their fates like shadows. These tales carried an emotional weight that resonated deeply, reminding audiences of the fragility of human ambition in the face of divine power. Even the common people weren't immune to the influence of Egyptian curses. Farmers in the Roman countryside, upon hearing tales of cursed pharaohs, began inscribing their own warnings on boundary stones. "May the gods strike down any who move this marker," one such stone read, a faint echo of the pharaoh's unyielding decrees. It was a testament to how far the shadow of Egypt's curses had spread, shaping even the smallest corners of the ancient world. And yet, for all their adaptations and interpretations, the Greeks and Romans never fully grasped the depth of Egyptian curses. They borrowed, they transformed, but they couldn't capture the raw, otherworldly power that pulsed through those ancient warnings. To the Egyptians, a curse was more than a threat. It was a bond between the mortal and the divine, an unbreakable promise that echoed through eternity. The Greeks and Romans, despite their attempts, could only stand at the edge of this abyss, gazing into its depths with a mix of awe and fear. They were drawn to the power of Egyptian curses, but they also understood their limits. To tamper too much, to stray too far, was to risk awakening forces they could neither control nor comprehend. In the end, the legacy of Egyptian curses in Greek and Roman culture is one of fascination tempered by caution. It's a story of civilizations grappling with the unknown, their interpretations shaped by their own beliefs and fears. But even as they adapted these curses to fit their world, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were touching something ancient and untouchable, something that whispered of a power far greater than their own. The night sky stretched wide, heavy with stars that seemed to pulse with secrets older than the earth itself. Around a crackling fire, elders whispered stories, their voices low and weighty with meaning. The wind carried their words into the surrounding darkness, threading through the trees and into the hearts of those who listened. One tale lingered longer than the rest, a tale of a curse, spoken in a time long past, yet alive and breathing in the present. In the lands neighboring ancient Egypt, curses carried a weight that could silence a gathering and stir the bravest into unease. These were not idle threats or poetic warnings, they were living forces, woven into the very fabric of existence. The people believed in the unseen connections that bound the living and the spiritual realms. To speak a curse was to call upon those threads, to summon powers older and far more potent than mortal comprehension. In Nubia, the traditions of curses blended seamlessly with their reverence for ancestors and the spirits that guarded the land. A hunter who disrespected the sacred groves, who dared to kill without offering thanks, would find himself trapped in an endless cycle of misfortune. His arrows would miss their mark, his family would grow distant, and whispers would haunt his nights. It was said the spirits of the land would not forgive easily, their wrath as enduring as the desert winds. Further west, among the kingdoms that thrived along the Niger River, the idea of curses extended to the very heart of community life. A potter might curse the clay that refused to mold, but more often, curses were spoken in defense of justice. If a thief stole from a neighbor, they risked a spoken malediction: "May your hands wither, may your wealth turn to ash." These words, spoken with conviction, weren't taken lightly. A cursed thief might find their life unraveling in strange and inexplicable ways, crops failing, tools breaking, and loved ones falling ill. The people didn't call this coincidence, they called it balance. Among the Berber tribes of North Africa, curses were woven into their understanding of protection and retribution. These were people who lived with the desert as both friend and adversary, and their curses carried the weight of survival. A camel thief, for instance, might find themselves cursed to wander the desert endlessly, the dunes shifting endlessly to lead them astray. It wasn't just a matter of punishment, it was a way of ensuring that the sacred trust of survival wasn't broken. In the rainforests of Central Africa, the curses whispered in secret ceremonies carried a terrifying immediacy. Here, the power of words was believed to summon the spirits of ancestors, who would act as enforcers of the curse. A betrayed lover might cry out in anguish, calling on the spirits to bind the betrayer to a fate of loneliness and regret. People feared these curses not only for their potential to harm, but for the knowledge that they could not be undone lightly. To lift such a curse, one had to undergo rituals of atonement that could last weeks, if not months. In the kingdoms of the Yoruba people, curses carried a spiritual resonance that rippled through the community. The words themselves weren't seen as harmful, it was the intention behind them, the emotional weight that gave them life. A person wronged might curse their betrayer by invoking the Orishas, the powerful deities who governed the forces of nature and destiny. These curses weren't uttered in anger but in solemnity, with offerings and prayers to back their weight. To violate such a curse was to challenge not just the person who spoke it but the gods themselves. And yet, curses were not always about destruction or vengeance. In many African cultures, they served as guardians, protecting sacred spaces and traditions. In Ethiopia, ancient churches were often shielded by curses inscribed in the walls or spoken during their construction. These curses promised misfortune to those who dared desecrate the holy grounds. Travelers spoke of inexplicable illnesses befalling those who tried to loot these sacred sites, their suffering seen as proof of the curse's power. There was a delicate balance in these beliefs. Curses were tools, wielded with caution and reverence. They could bring justice, but they could also spiral out of control, affecting not just the target but those around them. This duality was reflected in the stories passed down through generations, stories of curses spoken in haste, their unintended consequences rippling outward like stones dropped in still water. A tale from the Ashanti people tells of a woman who cursed a river after it swept away her child. In her grief, she called upon the spirits to dry up the waters, to punish the river for its cruelty. For years, the river dwindled, its once lush banks turning to dust. The people suffered, their crops failing, their livestock perishing. Only when the woman's descendants performed a ritual of forgiveness did the river begin to flow again, its waters carrying both life and the memory of the curse. These stories weren't just warnings, they were lessons, reminders of the power of words and the responsibility that came with wielding them. To curse was to take on the burden of that power, to summon forces that could not be easily controlled. The people of these cultures understood this, their respect for curses born not of fear but of an understanding of the delicate threads that held their world together. Even today, whispers of these ancient curses linger in the lands they once shaped. They're found in the quiet moments, in the stories told around fires, and the way people tread carefully through sacred spaces. The power of these curses hasn't diminished with time, it has only shifted, taking on new forms while retaining the weight of their origins. To hear one is to feel the pulse of a history that refuses to fade, its heart still beating strong and steady, reminding us of the forces that connect the seen and the unseen. The air was heavy, thick with an unspoken tension. A circle of elders sat in the flickering glow of the fire, their faces carved with lines of wisdom and years. One among them, his voice measured and deliberate, recited words not meant for the faint-hearted. The audience held their breath, not out of fear but out of respect. Each syllable carried the weight of a moral choice, a silent question that lingered in the air: should these words ever be spoken? In ancient times, a curse wasn't just a reaction, it was a decision, a moral crossroad. To invoke a curse meant taking justice into one's own hands, appealing to forces beyond human control. But this wasn't done lightly. There were rules, unspoken yet understood, that governed the use of such power. Words could become weapons, but with every weapon came a burden. A farmer who found his land stolen might stand beneath the wide-open sky, his heart heavy with anger and despair. He would call upon the gods to see his plight, to punish the thief with barren fields and endless misfortune. But in that moment of anger, was he right to ask for suffering in return for suffering? Did the gods look upon his plea with understanding, or with disappointment? Curses were not tools for petty grievances. They were acts of desperation, spoken when all other avenues had failed. A wronged individual often sought the guidance of a priest or seer, someone who could discern whether the curse was justified. This act alone was a moral safeguard, a moment of reflection that forced the cursed and the curser to weigh their choices. Was the crime so grave that it warranted divine retribution? Was it worth risking the consequences that might ripple back to the one who spoke the curse? For the ancient Egyptians, curses carried an inherent duality. They were both protection and punishment, wielded not only to guard tombs and treasures, but also to uphold the balance of Ma'at, the sacred order of the universe. Invoking a curse without cause was seen as an affront to this order, a selfish act that could invite chaos. And yet, to leave an injustice unanswered was equally dangerous, threatening to tip the scales toward disorder. A story from the time of the Pharaohs tells of a laborer who cursed his overseer after being unfairly beaten. The overseer, oblivious to the laborer's plea to the gods, carried on with his life. Days turned into weeks, and one morning, the overseer fell ill. His strength drained away, his skin grew cold, and the once feared figure became a shadow of himself. The laborer, seeing this, began to question his own heart. Had his anger justified such a fate? Or had he, in his pain, unleashed a curse too cruel for the crime? In Mesopotamia, similar dilemmas unfolded. A merchant might call upon the gods to curse a deceitful partner, yet the weight of the curse didn't fall only on the deceiver. The act of cursing itself left a mark, an invisible scar on the soul of the one who spoke it. The Sumerians believed that invoking divine wrath required the curser to stand in the light of absolute truth. If their cause was tainted by lies or selfishness, the curse could turn on them, a snake biting its own tail. The ethics of curses also found their way into family life. A mother might curse the illness afflicting her child, calling for the sickness to leave and never return. Yet, what if that sickness found another host? What if the curse, in its blind journey, hurt someone else? These questions haunted those who relied on curses to seek relief or justice, a constant reminder of the delicate balance they risked upsetting. Among the Greeks and Romans, this moral complexity deepened. Curses, often etched onto lead tablets and buried in secret, were acts of secrecy and shame. They were whispered in moments of raw emotion, when the pain of betrayal or loss overwhelmed reason. Yet even then, philosophers debated the ethics of such acts. Plato warned against the corruption of the soul that came from harboring vengeance, while others argued that curses were a necessary tool to deter wrongdoing in a world often devoid of fairness. But perhaps the most poignant moments came when curses were regretted. A widow, consumed by grief, might curse the man she believed responsible for her husband's death. Years later, upon learning of the man's innocence, she would carry the weight of her words like a stone in her heart. Could the curse be undone? Could forgiveness wash away the guilt of invoking harm, even if the harm was never deserved? In these ancient societies, the power of curses was rooted in belief, but their morality was rooted in humanity. To curse was to act as both judge and executioner, to step into a role that many felt should belong only to the divine. This act required not just courage but also clarity, a deep understanding of right and wrong that could easily be clouded by anger or sorrow. Even in communities where curses were seen as sacred, the act of cursing came with warnings. Elders would remind the young to think before they spoke, to consider not only the immediate impact of their words, but the long-term consequences. A curse, once spoken, could not be taken back. It lived on, a force unleashed into the world, carrying the intent of its maker like a shadow that never faded. Perhaps this is why curses were so often accompanied by rituals of purification or atonement. The act of cursing might resolve one pain, but it created another, a moral wound that needed healing. To curse was to walk a fine line between justice and vengeance, protection and harm, righteousness and arrogance. It was an act that forced individuals to confront the deepest parts of themselves, to question not just their beliefs but their very humanity. The firelight flickered lower as the elder finished his tale, his voice trembling with emotion. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Each listener felt the echoes of those ancient words, the timeless questions they carried. When is it right to curse? And when is it better to let go? The answers, like the curses themselves, lay hidden in the fragile balance of the human heart. The air inside the tomb was suffocating, not because of its stillness, but because of something else, a weight that pressed against the chest, stirring an uneasy feeling. It wasn't the scent of dust and time or the oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow every flicker of torchlight. No, it was something unseen, something whispered into the walls themselves. An inscription ran along the edges of the burial chamber, the words sharp and defiant against the ancient stone. It warned of misfortune, sickness, even death to anyone who dared disturb the eternal slumber of the one entombed here. The explorers paused, their breaths shallow. Rational minds told them curses weren't real, yet their hearts raced. Fear had a way of ignoring logic. What is it about curses that grips the human soul with such intensity? Is it the words themselves, crafted with precision and malice? Or is it the idea that those words carry power beyond our understanding, a force that lingers long after the speaker has turned to dust? For centuries, Egyptian curses have haunted imaginations, their presence weaving through myths and tales, igniting both fascination and terror. Perhaps it's because these curses seem alive, as though they breathe within the confines of tombs, waiting patiently for a trespasser to fulfill their doom. They aren't just threats, they feel like promises, as if written not by human hands, but by an unseen cosmic force intent on justice. How does one dismiss such weighty words when standing in their shadow? Even the skeptics, those who laugh at the idea of supernatural revenge, hesitate when faced with the stories. The archaeologists who succumbed to mysterious illnesses, the workers who fell victim to inexplicable accidents, all after entering a tomb marked with a curse. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the timing often feels too perfect, too chilling, to be anything but intentional. This fear isn't merely about what happens, it's about why. Curses remind us of the fragility of life, the delicate thread that holds us between fortune and misfortune. They make us question whether our actions, no matter how small, have consequences we can't foresee. In a world driven by science and reason, curses are the wild card, the unexplainable force that keeps us awake at night. Think of the Pharaoh's curse, the most famous of all. When Lord Carnarvon died after the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, newspapers exploded with tales of ancient wrath. A mosquito bite, infected and ignored, was the logical explanation for his death. Yet, for those who knew of the curse, logic didn't matter. The curse felt real, a silent reminder of forces greater than human understanding. And what of those who don't believe but still hesitate? A tourist stands before an ancient sarcophagus, her hand trembling as she reaches out to touch it. Her guide assures her it's safe, curses are just myths. But something in her gut makes her pull back. Why risk it? That's the essence of the fear. What if? What if the stories are true? What if unseen eyes are watching, waiting to exact punishment for even the smallest intrusion? Fear of curses taps into something primal, a part of us that feels the weight of every action. They remind us of the sacredness of boundaries, the thin line between respect and violation. Ancient Egyptians understood this deeply. Their curses weren't just about protecting treasures, they were about preserving harmony, ensuring that what was sacred remained untouched. This fear has evolved over time, shaping how we view curses today. Modern minds might dismiss the supernatural aspect, but the fear remains. It morphs, becoming more psychological than mystical. We fear what curses represent, the idea that actions have unseen consequences, that justice may come not in ways we understand, but in ways we fear the most. The enduring power of Egyptian curses isn't just in their words or their threats, it's in their ability to make us confront ourselves. They force us to think about our choices, about the respect we show to what came before us. They are a mirror, reflecting not just fear but guilt, awe, and an overwhelming sense of being part of something far greater than ourselves. And perhaps that's the heart of the matter. Curses linger in our minds because they aren't just about tombs or treasures, they're about the human condition. They are about the unseen ties that bind us to the past, the present, and the future. They whisper to us not just of punishment but of responsibility, of the weight of our existence in a world filled with unseen forces. As the explorers left the tomb, their thoughts heavy, the warning etched into the stone followed them. Not a single step was taken without the sense that something was watching, something ancient and unyielding. Fear, it seemed, wasn't about what was real or imagined. It was about what lingered, like the words of a curse that refused to be forgotten. The ancient script glimmered faintly under the flickering light, its meaning both haunting and profound. The carved symbols, etched thousands of years ago, seemed to hum with a life of their own. They weren't just warnings, they were voices from the past, carrying wisdom wrapped in fear, power, and mystery. The curse was not a mere threat but a testament to values that resonated beyond the grave. How could something written to instill dread feel so much like a lesson meant to endure? The curses of ancient times weren't just crafted to scare away thieves or desecrators. They carried a deeper weight, a reminder of the delicate balance between life and the unseen forces that shaped it. Their words whispered not just of vengeance but of justice, of respect, of understanding the things we so often overlook in our relentless pursuit of control. In these traditions, there is a startling honesty about the human condition. They don't shy away from acknowledging the shadows we cast, the wrongs we commit, and the consequences that ripple through time. They teach us accountability in a way that modern systems of justice cannot, through fear laced with reverence, through punishment tempered by morality. Consider the act of carving a curse onto a tomb. The writer didn't rush through the task. Each word was chosen with care, each symbol etched with purpose. The curse was a vow, a commitment to protecting the sacred. It wasn't just about what was buried beneath, it was about the legacy left above. These ancient words were a warning to those who dared to disrupt, but they were also a challenge to those who lived. Would they uphold the sacred? Would they honor the invisible threads that connect one generation to the next? And what of those who ignored the warnings, who stepped into forbidden spaces with greed in their hearts? Their fate, according to these traditions, was not just misfortune, it was the stripping away of their humanity. To disrespect the sacred was to lose something within yourself, something irreplaceable. These lessons feel as urgent now as they must have been then. We live in a world that often forgets how actions echo. We take and destroy with the ease of those who believe in infinite second chances. But ancient curses remind us that nothing comes without cost. They whisper of boundaries, of things meant to remain untouched. They force us to confront the truth that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. And yet, they are not merely about fear. They are about responsibility. The one who writes the curse takes on a burden, too. It is a vow to protect, to defend, to stand as a guardian even when no one is watching. It speaks of a love so deep that it stretches beyond life itself. To invoke such power is to recognize the sanctity of what is at stake, whether it is a life, a memory, or a legacy. In the quiet moments, when the winds carry the echoes of these curses, there is an undeniable clarity. They aren't about death, they're about the life that remains. They urge us to tread carefully, to honor what came before, and to leave behind something worthy of protection. The modern world, for all its advancements, often loses sight of these truths. We dismiss the unseen forces as superstition, forgetting that their wisdom lies not in the supernatural but in the deeply human. The curse reminds us that our actions carry weight, that what we do today will shape what comes tomorrow. It teaches us humility, urging us to look beyond ourselves and consider the larger web of existence. And so, the ancient carvings remain, their words as alive as the day they were inscribed. They may threaten, but they also teach. They may warn, but they also guide. They hold up a mirror to our souls, daring us to see ourselves clearly. In their echoes, we find not just fear but an enduring reminder of the strength and fragility of being human. The sands whispered their eternal song, brushing gently against the towering monuments of a civilization that once held the world in awe. Beneath the weight of centuries, those whispers carried stories, some rooted in stone, others sculpted by imagination. The line between what was real and what was conjured had blurred long ago, yet the echoes of both still held power. A scribe in the shadow of a temple may have once etched the truth, his hand steady, his ink precise. But over time, the simplicity of his account became adorned with the embellishments of storytellers who followed. Truth became shrouded in the drama of myth. The pharaoh wasn't just a ruler anymore, he was a god who could command the stars. The tomb wasn't merely a resting place, it became a gateway guarded by curses. What began as history evolved into something more, a reflection of humanity's hunger for wonder and meaning. It is tempting to think that those myths diminish the truth, that they distort the beauty of what once was. But when you stand before a weathered relic, you feel something that no tale can fabricate. It's in the cold touch of stone, the precise angles of carvings, the worn steps that tell of countless lives that passed before you. Those moments hold a purity, an honesty that myths, for all their charm, cannot replicate. Yet myths serve their own purpose. They are the spark that keeps the stories alive, that ensures the past isn't forgotten. The idea of a pharaoh's curse, of treasures protected by supernatural forces, might seem fanciful. But that fear, that awe, drives people to remember, to care. It keeps the tombs from fading into oblivion, turning history into something that still breathes, even if its breath is tinged with exaggeration. There is something raw in the way myths grip us. They play on our deepest fears and our wildest dreams. They make the ordinary extraordinary, casting shadows where there were none and light where there was darkness. But beneath it all lies the truth, small, steady, and unyielding. It waits patiently, knowing that the myths cannot exist without it. Sometimes, separating the truth feels impossible. Did the ancients truly believe in the curses they wrote? Or were those warnings crafted for the living, a tool of deterrence rather than a glimpse into their fears? The answer might not matter as much as we think. What does matter is the humanity behind it, the minds that crafted those words, the hands that shaped those stones, the hearts that beat with hope and fear as they built something meant to last forever. History doesn't always give us clear answers. Instead, it gives us fragments, pieces of a puzzle scattered across time. Myths fill the gaps with color and drama, creating a story that feels whole even if it isn't. And in those stories, we find ourselves. Our doubts, our desires, our need to make sense of a world that often defies understanding. The weight of those myths is felt in every question we ask. Did the Nile truly rise in response to the gods' anger, or was it just the earth's rhythm? Did the pharaohs wield divine power, or were they simply men trying to leave their mark? The myths answer with certainty, while the truth whispers, look closer. And so, we look. We dig into the earth, into the texts, into the memories passed down through generations. We peel back the layers, not to destroy the myths, but to understand them. To see where they begin and where the truth might be waiting, quiet and steadfast. The ancients understood the power of both truth and story. They carved facts into stone but left room for interpretation, for wonder. They knew that history alone might fade, but history wrapped in myth would endure. It's why we stand in awe of them, not just for what they built, but for what they believed. For their ability to weave their lives into something eternal. In the end, perhaps the greatest lesson is this, that truth and myth are not enemies. They are partners in the dance of memory. One provides the foundation, the other the spark. Together, they create something greater than either could alone, a legacy that resonates through time, touching hearts long after the hands that shaped it have turned to dust.